She pulled into the parking lot at 6:45, noting that Brandon's BMW X5, purchased with his signing bonus, he'd made sure everyone knew wasn't there yet. He rarely arrived before 9, rolling in after the instructors had already prepped the gear and met with clients, swooping in to glad hand the wealthy ones and take credit for the operation. Sarah parked in her usual spot at the far end of the lot, the spot she'd claimed years ago because it was under a big spruce that kept her truck cool in summer, and saw that Tom Ryder's Jeep was already there. Tom was ex-military, 53 years old, built like a bear himself, and about as talkative as one too. He'd been a survival instructor in the Canadian Armed Forces for 20 years before retiring and taking a job at Mountain Edge, and he'd become Sarah's closest friend and ally at the school. He was also one of the few white people she'd met who actually listened when she talked about indigenous land management and traditional ecological knowledge, instead of just nodding politely while waiting to interrupt. She found him in the equipment shed, checking harnesses and ropes for the rock climbing course scheduled for later in the week. "Morning," he grunted without looking up, his breath visible in the cold air. The shed wasn't heated, another cost-cutting measure Brandon had implemented. "Morning," Sarah replied, grabbing her own checklist and starting to inventory the camping gear for the overnight survival course she was leading tomorrow. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the familiar routine of checking equipment, testing buckles, examining rope for fraying. This was what she loved about the work. The attention to detail, the knowledge that thorough preparation could mean the difference between a successful trip and a tragedy. "He's bringing someone around today," Tom said finally, his tone carefully neutral. Sarah's hand stilled on the tent she was examining. "Who?" she asked, though she already knew she wasn't going to like the answer. "Some hotshot from one of those reality TV survival shows. Wants to upgrade our profile, apparently. Going to observe your intro course this morning." Tom's opinion of reality TV survival experts was well documented and unprintable. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. The intro course was her bread and butter, a 4-hour basics workshop that ran every Monday and Wednesday, teaching clients fire starting, shelter building, navigation, and wildlife awareness. She'd refined it over years until it was perfect, a carefully calibrated mix of practical skills and confidence building that sent clients home feeling capable and inspired. The course had a waiting list 3 months long and a 5-star rating on every review site. And now, Brandon was bringing in some TV personality to observe it, which meant to critique it, which meant to justify replacing her with someone cheaper or more marketable or more willing to compromise safety for entertainment value. "What's the guy's name?" Sarah asked, forcing her voice to stay level. "Marcus Sterling. Apparently he had a show called Extreme Wild or something. It got canceled after 2 seasons. Tom's tone made it clear what he thought of that. Sarah had never heard of the show, but that didn't mean much. She didn't have cable, and when she did have free time, she spent it reading, or hiking, or helping her mom, or visiting elders on the reserve, who still knew the old stories and the old ways. "I'm sure it'll be fine," she said, not believing it for a second. Tom made a sound that might have been agreement, or might have been something much more skeptical. The morning class had 12 students, which was perfect. Small enough that Sarah could give everyone individual attention, large enough that the group dynamics worked. They ranged from a nervous-looking woman in her 60s who'd said she was taking the course to impress her grandchildren, to a trio of university students who'd shown up hungover and overconfident, to a middle-aged couple who held hands and listened with the intensity of people who genuinely wanted to learn. Sarah met them at the trailhead at 8:30, did her usual introductions, made sure everyone had signed the liability waivers and had appropriate clothing. She was just starting her opening talk, the one about how wilderness skills aren't about being macho or proving anything, but about understanding and respecting the environment. When Brandon appeared on the trail with another man in tow, Brandon Whitmore looked exactly like what he was, a trust fund kid playing at being rugged. He was 32, but looked younger, with the kind of polished handsomeness that came from expensive haircuts and good dental care, and never worrying about where the next meal was coming from. His outdoor gear was always brand new, always the most expensive brands, and always spotlessly clean, because he never actually used it for anything more strenuous than walking from his car to the lodge. He had his father's easy confidence, the assumption that every room he walked into was his by right, and he'd perfected the art of smiling while delivering insults so smoothly that you couldn't call him on it without looking oversensitive. "Sorry to interrupt, Sarah," he called out, though his tone made it clear he wasn't sorry at all. "I brought Marcus Sterling to observe your class." "Marcus, this is Sarah Blackwater, one of our instructors." "One of our instructors," not our senior instructor, or our curriculum developer, or any of the actual titles she'd earned. Just one of our instructors, as if she were interchangeable with the 19-year-old summer hires. Sarah swallowed the flash of anger and extended her hand to Marcus Sterling, who looked like he'd walked out of a cologne commercial. He was probably in his early 40s, with the kind of tan that came from beach vacations rather than actual outdoor work, and teeth so white they were probably veneer. His handshake was too firm, the grip of a man who thought physical dominance was how you established authority. "Pleased to meet you," Sarah said with professional courtesy she didn't feel. "Marcus has extensive experience in wilderness survival," Brandon continued, and Sarah noticed he was speaking to the class now, not to her. "He's going to be consulting with us on ways to enhance our program, make it more dynamic." Dynamic was a word people used when they meant flashy, exciting, Instagram-friendly. Dynamic was the opposite of safe. Dynamic got people killed. But Sarah just nodded and said, "Welcome, we're just getting started with the basics." She turned back to her class, trying to find the thread of her opening talk, but Brandon wasn't done. "Marcus was just saying that 4 hours seems like a long time for an intro course. Most places do these in 2 hours. Maybe we could look at streamlining?" Sarah felt 12 pairs of eyes on her, felt the nervous grandmother's anxiety spike, felt her own blood pressure rising. "The 4-hour format allows us to cover each skill thoroughly and practice until students feel confident," she said evenly. "It's one of the reasons our course has such high satisfaction ratings, and why people feel safe enough to sign up for our advanced programs." She could have added that their safety record was impeccable, that several competitors had been shut down after accidents, that speed and quality were inversely related when you were teaching people skills that could save their lives. But she didn't, because Brandon's smile had gone sharp, and she knew that any pushback would be noted and used against her later. "Well, we'll see," Brandon said, in the tone of someone who'd already made up his mind. "Carry on." He and Marcus moved to the side of the group, and Sarah had to teach her class with the two of them watching, whispering to each other, occasionally laughing. She pushed through the fire-starting segment, showing 3 methods, letting everyone practice with the bow drill until they could produce an ember, teaching them about tinder bundles and kindling and the importance of preparation. The nervous grandmother got her fire started on the 3rd try, and her face lit up with pure joy, and Sarah felt that familiar warmth of satisfaction that came from helping someone discover their own capability. This was why she did this work. These moments when people realized they were stronger than they thought. But Marcus and Brandon kept murmuring to each other, and during the shelter building segment, Marcus actually interrupted. "In my experience," he said, his voice loud enough that everyone stopped to listen, "you can teach shelter building in about 20 minutes if you just show them the lean-to method. All this stuff about different designs for different conditions just confuses people." Sarah took a breath, centered herself the way her grandfather had taught her. "Different conditions require different approaches," she explained, keeping her voice calm and educational. "A lean-to that works beautifully in dry weather becomes a bathtub in rain. Understanding the principles means you can adapt to whatever situation you encounter." Marcus shrugged. "I've spent 3 months in the Amazon and 2 months in the Sahara. Never needed more than a basic lean-to." The university students looked impressed. The older woman looked confused. The couple looked worried. Sarah wanted to point out that spending 3 months in the Amazon with a camera crew and a support team wasn't the same as actual survival, that he'd probably never spent a single night alone in the wilderness, with nothing but a knife and his wits. Instead, she said, "That's great that that worked for you. Here in the Canadian Rockies, we need to account for conditions that can change dramatically and quickly." She moved on to navigation, demonstrating how to use the sun and stars and landmarks, how to read terrain, how to avoid getting turned around. When they broke for lunch, Brandon pulled her aside while the students ate the sandwiches the lodge had provided. "Can I give you some feedback?" he asked, in the tone of someone who'd already decided she needed correcting. Sarah nodded, keeping her face neutral. Marcus feels like you're being a bit technical, like maybe too much detail. The client seemed kind of overwhelmed. Sarah thought about the grandmother's smile when her fire caught, about the couple taking notes in their spiral notebook, about the university students actually paying attention for once. The feedback forms consistently rate the course 5 stars, she said quietly. Students regularly comment that they appreciate the thoroughness. Brandon's smile didn't reach his eyes. Sure, but we're trying to grow here, expand our market, and if we can do the same course in 2 hours instead of 4, we can run more sessions, accommodate more clients. That's just basic business sense. It's not basic business sense if someone gets hurt because they didn't learn the skills properly, Sarah said, and immediately regretted it when she saw Brandon's expression harden. I'm not sure I appreciate the implication that I don't care about safety, he said coldly. I'm just suggesting that maybe you're not the best judge of what modern clients want. Marcus has experience in this industry. He knows what sells. Sarah bit back the response that rose to her lips. That Marcus's show got canceled, that reality TV survival and actual wilderness education were completely different things, that she'd been doing this job successfully since before Brandon graduated high school. Instead, she said, "I'll keep that in mind." Brandon nodded, satisfied that he'd established dominance. Good. Oh, and we need to talk about your curriculum development work. I'm thinking we might not need a dedicated position for that going forward. It's really more of a management function, which meant he wanted to take over curriculum development himself, despite having no qualifications whatsoever, or more likely hand it to Marcus Sterling. Sarah felt the ground shifting under her feet, felt the first real tremor of fear. The afternoon section went better because Brandon and Marcus left after lunch, claiming they had meetings. Sarah taught wildlife awareness, her favorite part of the course because it was where she could share not just the technical knowledge, but the philosophy behind it, the understanding that humans were visitors in the animal's home, that respect and awareness were forms of intelligence, that fear could coexist with appreciation. She taught them about bear behavior, about reading signs, about making noise and carrying spray, and understanding that bears rarely attacked humans. And when they did, it was usually because the human had done something stupid. She taught them about elk and moose and cougars, about seasonal patterns and territorial behavior. She taught them that the wilderness wasn't a theme park or a gym or a place to prove your dominance. It was a complex living system that would welcome you if you approached it with humility and crush you if you approached it with arrogance. The class ended at 12:30, with everyone looking tired but satisfied, and the nervous grandmother hugged Sarah and said it had been the best day she'd had in years. That should have been enough. That should have been what Sarah took home with her. But instead, she drove back to the reserve, feeling like she was watching her life crumble, watching everything she'd built being undermined by a man who'd never had to build anything himself. Her father was awake when she got home, sitting in his recliner with an oxygen tank beside him, watching a hockey game with the sound off, because they'd returned the cable box months ago. How was work? He asked in Cree, and Sarah answered in the same language, telling him it was fine, not mentioning Brandon or Marcus or the feeling that she was about to lose her job. Her father had worked in the mines for 30 years, had breathed in coal dust and chemicals until his lungs were barely functional, had watched the company declare bankruptcy and escape paying the pensions they'd promised. He didn't need to hear that his daughter was facing the same kind of corporate betrayal, the same game where people with money made the rules and people without it paid the price. Sarah heated up leftover stew for dinner, helped her mother with the dishes, then went for a run on the trails behind the reserve because she needed to move, needed to think, needed to remember who she was beyond what Brandon Whitmore thought of her. The trails were empty in the fading light, the snow crunching under her feet, her breath visible in the cold air. She ran hard, pushing herself up the hills until her legs burned and her lungs ached. And somewhere around mile 3, she started to feel like herself again. She'd been through worse than this. She'd survived her mother being taken to residential school, survived growing up in poverty, survived the racism and the low expectations, and the guidance counselors who tried to steer her toward cosmetology school instead of the forestry program she'd wanted. She'd survived an abusive boyfriend in her 20s who tried to convince her she was worthless, survived the climbing accident that had broken her leg in 3 places and that everyone had said would end her outdoor career. She'd survived because she was tougher than people gave her credit for, because she knew how to endure, because her ancestors had faced genocide and survived, and passed that survival down through the generations. Brandon Whitmore was just another obstacle, just another person who thought his money made him powerful. The wilderness didn't care about money, and neither did Sarah. Over the next 3 weeks, Brandon's campaign to undermine her became more overt. He started showing up at her classes unannounced with Marcus Sterling in tow, interrupting to offer suggestions that were really criticisms. He questioned her methods in front of clients, second-guessed her safety calls, suggested that maybe she was being overly cautious when she insisted on rescheduling a mountaineering course because of avalanche warnings. He sent her emails late at night with ideas for improvement that read like a list of complaints. He started requiring her to submit lesson plans for approval before every course, even though she'd been teaching these same courses successfully for years. He scheduled mandatory staff meetings during her class times, forcing her to get other instructors to cover for her, then criticized her in the meetings for not being a team player. It was a masterclass in workplace harassment, subtle enough that she couldn't quite call it out without seeming paranoid or oversensitive, persistent enough that it was grinding her down. Tom noticed. "He's trying to push you out," he said one morning as they were loading gear for a winter camping course. "He wants to bring in his buddy Marcus, and he needs to justify it by making it look like you're not cutting it." Sarah knew he was right, but knowing it didn't give her any solutions. "What am I supposed to do?" she asked, hearing the frustration in her own voice. "I can't afford to lose this job. My parents need the insurance, and even if I could afford it, I built this program. These courses are mine. I'm not going to let some trust fund kid destroy them." Tom was quiet for a long moment, checking knots with the kind of methodical care that made him a good instructor. "Document everything," he finally said. "Every incident, every interruption, every safety concern he dismisses. Get it all in writing, because this is going to come to a head, and when it does, you want evidence." Sarah started keeping a log, noting dates and times, and exactly what was said. She saved every email Brandon sent her. She kept copies of her lesson plans, and her safety reports, and her course evaluations. She started CCing the main office on everything, creating a paper trail that couldn't be erased. And she kept teaching, kept doing the job she loved, with the same thoroughness and care she'd always brought to it, refusing to let Brandon's presence make her sloppy, or angry, or careless. But it was exhausting, the constant vigilance, the knowledge that she was being watched for any mistake, any excuse to fire her. She started having trouble sleeping, lying awake in the dark, listening to her father cough and running through scenarios in her head, trying to figure out how she'd support her family if she lost this job. There weren't a lot of survival instructor positions in Alberta, and the ones that existed were mostly seasonal. She could probably get work as a park ranger, but those jobs required relocating, and she couldn't leave her parents. She felt trapped, felt the walls closing in, and the worst part was that Brandon knew it. He knew she couldn't just quit, knew she needed this job too much to fight back effectively. The situation reached a crisis point in late April when Brandon called an all-staff meeting to announce his restructuring plan. Sarah arrived at the meeting room to find Tom already there, along with the 6 other full-time instructors and the dozen seasonal workers who'd been brought on for the summer season. Brandon stood at the front of the room looking pleased with himself, with Marcus Sterling beside him, wearing an expression of calculated sympathy. "Thanks for coming, everyone," Brandon said, his voice full of false enthusiasm. "I wanted to share some exciting news about the direction we're taking Mountain Edge. As you know, we've been working on ways to enhance our profile, modernize our approach, and maximize our revenue potential. I'm pleased to announce that Marcus Sterling will be joining us as Director of Programming." There was a moment of shocked silence. Tom's jaw tightened. Sarah felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. Marcus brings extensive media experience and a fresh perspective on wilderness education, Brandon continued. He'll be overseeing all course development and implementation going forward. We're also streamlining our instructor team. Several positions will be converted to seasonal contracts, and we'll be implementing new efficiency standards for course delivery. Sarah raised her hand, her heart pounding. "Can you clarify what streamlining means specifically?" Brandon's smile was sharp. "It means we're looking at instructor productivity and course profitability on an individual basis. Instructors who can't meet the new efficiency standards will be transitioned to different roles, or if necessary, let go." He was looking right at her when he said it. The message was clear: adapt to Marcus's approach or lose your job. Sarah felt the room's attention on her, felt the other instructors' fear and sympathy, and their own self-preservation kicking in. No one was going to speak up for her because everyone needed their jobs too. "What are these efficiency standards based on?" she asked, keeping her voice level. "Are they grounded in safety data, client satisfaction metrics?" Brandon's expression hardened. "They're based on modern industry standards and best practices. Marcus will be explaining the details in individual meetings with each instructor. This meeting is just to announce the overall direction." After the meeting, Tom pulled Sarah aside in the parking lot. "This is retaliation," he said bluntly. "You need to lawyer up. This is textbook workplace discrimination." But Sarah knew that lawyers cost money she didn't have, that legal battles took years, that even if she won, she'd never work in this industry again because no one hired whistleblowers. The system was designed to protect people like Brandon, not people like her. "I'll figure something out," she said, not believing it. That night, lying in bed unable to sleep, listening to the wind and her father's labored breathing and the sound of her own racing thoughts, Sarah made a decision. She wasn't going to quit, and she wasn't going to let Brandon push her out, but she also wasn't going to fight him on his terms. Corporate warfare, lawyers, HR complaints, those were tools of his world, and in his world, he held all the power. But there was another world, the world of rock and pine and snow and sky, the world where truth wasn't determined by who had the most money, but by who had the most skill. If Brandon Whitmore wanted to prove he could run a wilderness school, then he needed to prove he belonged in the wilderness, and Sarah was going to give him that opportunity. The Advanced Wilderness Survival course had been on the calendar for months, a week-long intensive program designed for experienced outdoors enthusiasts who wanted to push their limits. It ran twice a year, spring and fall, and was always led by Sarah because it required extensive knowledge of advanced skills and emergency medicine and bear country protocol. The spring session was scheduled for the third week of May and already had 12 participants registered, each paying $3,000 for the privilege. It was Mountain Edge's premium offering, the flagship program that gave them credibility with serious clients. 2 days after the restructuring announcement, Sarah walked into Brandon's office and suggested that he and Marcus should co-lead the course with her. "It would be a great opportunity for you both to demonstrate your expertise," she said calmly, "and for the clients to see the new direction the program is taking." Brandon looked suspicious, but his ego was bigger than his caution. "That's actually a good idea," he said slowly. "Show everyone that we're not just managers, we're practitioners." Marcus, who was sitting in Brandon's office because apparently he was already moved in, nodded enthusiastically. "I've been wanting to get back into the field. That's where the real work happens." Sarah smiled, the smile her grandmother had taught her, the one that looked pleasant but held steel underneath. "Great, I'll add you both to the course roster. We leave May 18th. You'll want to start preparing, reviewing the equipment list, brushing up on your wilderness medicine, getting in shape for the terrain. It's pretty demanding." Brandon waved a dismissive hand. "How hard can it be? It's basically fancy camping." Sarah's smile didn't waver. "Sure, fancy camping, in grizzly territory, during mating season. I'll send you the prep materials." Over the next 3 weeks, Sarah watched Brandon and Marcus make their preparations, which consisted mainly of buying expensive new gear and posting about it on social media. Neither of them seemed particularly interested in the actual training materials she'd sent, the protocols for bear encounters, the emergency medical procedures, the navigation challenges they'd be facing. They were treating it like an adventure vacation, a fun team-building exercise, not recognizing it for what it actually was, a test. Sarah, meanwhile, prepared with the kind of thoroughness that had kept her alive through dozens of wilderness expeditions. She reviewed every inch of the route they'd be taking, checked weather forecasts obsessively, coordinated with Parks Canada about recent bear activity, updated her first aid certification, and spent her evenings conditioning her body for the physical demands ahead. She also reached out to her network, the park rangers and conservation officers and indigenous land guardians who knew these mountains as well as she did. She wanted to make sure someone knew where they'd be, just in case. Tom pulled her aside a week before the course. "What are you doing?" he asked bluntly. "This feels like you're setting something up." Sarah met his eyes. "I'm doing my job," she said. "Brandon wants to prove he can run a wilderness school. This is his chance to show he actually knows what he's talking about. And if he doesn't..." She let the sentence trail off. Tom studied her face for a long moment. "You're playing with fire," he said finally. "If something goes wrong out there." Sarah cut him off. "Nothing is going to go wrong that I can't handle. I know what I'm doing, and I'm going to make sure everyone stays safe, even the idiots. But sometimes the best teacher is natural consequences. Sometimes people need to learn that the wilderness doesn't care about their resume or their bank account." Tom shook his head. "Just be careful. Brandon's father has a lot of power. If this backfires..." Sarah thought about her parents in their cold house, about the medical bills and the utility disconnection notices, and the years of being poor and powerless, while people like the Whitmores bought and sold politicians and policies and people's lives. "I know exactly how much power the Whitmores have," she said quietly. "That's why this needs to happen." The morning of May 18th dawned clear and cold, one of those perfect spring days when the mountains looked like they belonged on a postcard. The 12 clients arrived at the trailhead at 7 a.m., excited and nervous and laden with gear. Brandon and Marcus showed up 20 minutes late in Brandon's BMW, both wearing brand new Arc'teryx everything and looking like they'd stepped out of an REI catalog. Sarah did her pre-trip briefing, going over the route, the risks, the behavioral expectations, the emergency protocols. She emphasized the bear safety rules 3 times, made everyone demonstrate their bear spray, explained the food storage requirements. Marcus kept glancing at his phone, clearly impatient with what he considered excessive caution. Brandon checked his watch twice. The clients, thankfully, were taking it seriously. They were experienced enough to know that wilderness trips required attention to detail. They set out at 8:30, Sarah leading, Tom bringing up the rear, Brandon and Marcus scattered in the middle of the group. The first day's hike was relatively easy, 11 miles with moderate elevation gain, designed to let everyone adjust to the altitude and the weight of their packs. Sarah set a steady pace, stopping regularly to point out animal signs, edible plants, navigation landmarks. She was in her element here, every sense attuned to the forest, reading the land the way some people read books. She noticed the fresh grizzly scat near mile marker 3, noted the claw marks on a tree at mile 5, saw the torn up earth where a bear had been digging for roots. All normal spring bear activity, nothing alarming yet, but worth being aware of. She mentioned it to the group, reminded everyone about making noise and staying alert. Marcus rolled his eyes. "You're going to scare the clients with all this bear talk," he muttered as he passed her. "Most of them will never even see a bear." Sarah didn't bother arguing. She just made a mental note and kept walking. They made camp that evening beside a creek, in a clearing Sarah had used dozens of times before. Everyone set up their tents, hung their bear-proof food containers in the designated trees, practiced their bear safety drills. Sarah taught a session on emergency fire starting, and several clients tried and failed to get fires going with damp wood, which was exactly the point, learning what worked in real conditions, not perfect demonstration conditions. Brandon managed to get a fire started using a fire starter cube from his fancy new kit, and looked pleased with himself until Sarah gently pointed out that in a real survival situation, he wouldn't have fire starter cubes. His expression darkened. Marcus gave a little talk about his time in various exotic locations, name-dropping producers and network executives, and Sarah saw the client's eyes glaze over with polite boredom. They'd paid $3,000 for wilderness skills, not Hollywood gossip. The second day's hike was harder, 14 miles with significant elevation gain, moving into higher country, where the snow was still deep in shaded areas, and the air was noticeably thinner. Sarah noticed that Brandon was struggling more than he'd admit, breathing hard, falling behind the group, his face red with exertion. Marcus was doing better, but still not moving with the kind of confidence that came from real experience. Around midday, they stopped for lunch on a ridge with spectacular views of the surrounding peaks. Sarah was explaining glacial geology when she saw it, movement in the valley below, a distinctive rolling gait that could only be one thing. "Bear," she said calmly, and everyone went silent. It was a grizzly, probably a male based on the size, maybe 400 pounds, moving through the willows, about 300 yards downslope. "He doesn't know we're here," Sarah said quietly. "Everyone stay calm, stay together, get your bear spray ready. We're going to back away slowly and give him plenty of room." But Brandon, who'd been sitting on a rock and not paying attention, suddenly stood up and said loudly, "Where?" I want to get a photo. The bear's head swung up, looking directly at them. Sarah's heart rate spiked. Brandon, sit down and be quiet, she said firmly. Do not make yourself look like a threat. But Brandon was already pulling out his phone, zooming in on the bear. This is amazing. Marcus, get over here. Let's get a selfie with the bear in the background. The bear started moving toward them, not charging, but definitely interested, covering ground with alarming speed. Everyone, group up, Sarah commanded, using her instructor voice, the one that cut through panic. Make yourselves look big. Get your spray out. Brandon, put the goddamn phone away. He finally seemed to realize this wasn't a photo opportunity, and his face went pale as the bear closed to within 100 yards. Sarah stepped forward, holding her bear spray, and started talking to the bear in a firm, calm voice. Hey bear, we're just passing through. We don't want any trouble. You're beautiful, and we respect you, but we need you to give us space. The bear stopped about 50 yards away, standing on his hind legs to get a better look at them. Sarah could see every detail, the silver-tipped fur, the massive shoulders, the dark, intelligent eyes. Beautiful and deadly. She kept talking, kept her voice steady, even though her own adrenaline was surging. The bear dropped to all fours, huffed once, then turned and loped away into the timber. Sarah waited until it was completely out of sight before she let herself exhale. Is everyone okay? She asked, scanning the group. Everyone was wide-eyed but unharmed. Brandon looked like he might throw up. That, Sarah said, turning to face the clients, is why we take bear safety seriously. That's why we follow protocols. That's why we don't treat wildlife like props for social media. Bears are not here for our entertainment. This is their home, and when we're in it, we follow their rules. She looked directly at Brandon when she said it, and saw his shame transmute into anger. That night, after everyone else had gone to their tents, Brandon confronted her. You embarrassed me in front of the clients, he said, his voice tight with fury. Made me look incompetent. Sarah was checking the perimeter one more time, making sure all food was properly stored, and she didn't stop what she was doing. You made yourself look incompetent, she said evenly. I gave clear instructions about bear behavior, and you ignored them. You put everyone at risk because you wanted a photo. That's not my fault. Brandon stepped closer, invading her space in a way that was meant to intimidate. You know what I think? I think you set that up somehow. Led us right to that bear on purpose so you could play hero. The accusation was so ridiculous that Sarah actually laughed. You think I can control where wild animals go? You really don't understand how any of this works, do you? That was the wrong thing to say. Brandon's face flushed dark red. Watch yourself, Blackwater, he said, and there was real menace in his voice now. This little stunt isn't going to save your job. When we get back, I'm going to make sure you never work in this industry again. Sarah stood her ground, meeting his eyes. Threats don't work out here, Brandon. Money doesn't work out here. The only thing that matters out here is skill and knowledge and respect, and you don't have any of those things. You're a child playing dress-up in expensive gear, and sooner or later, the wilderness is going to make that very clear. She turned and walked to her tent, leaving him standing alone in the dark. She heard him mutter something, probably some racial slur, knowing his type, but she didn't react. She'd said what needed saying, and now there was no going back. Tomorrow would be the most challenging day of the trip, moving through a high alpine pass that was prime grizzly habitat this time of year. And Sarah was going to make absolutely certain that everyone survived it, even if it meant saving Brandon Whitmore from his own stupidity. The next morning dawned gray and threatening, with clouds moving in from the west and the smell of snow in the air. Sarah checked the weather report on her satellite communicator and frowned at what she saw, a system moving in faster than predicted, bringing the possibility of serious snowfall in the higher elevations. She gathered everyone for breakfast and explained the situation. We have two options. We can push through the pass today, which will be challenging but doable if we move efficiently, or we can camp here an extra day and wait for the weather to clear. The clients looked at each other uncertainly. It was Marcus who spoke up. I think we should push through. Part of wilderness training is learning to handle adverse conditions. We can't always wait for perfect weather. Sarah bit back her first response and said carefully, That's true, but there's a difference between handling adverse conditions and taking unnecessary risks. The pass is avalanche terrain. Fresh snow on the existing snowpack could be dangerous. Brandon, who'd been sulking since last night, suddenly became animated. "Are you saying you're not confident you can lead us through? Because that sounds like an admission of incompetence." The trap was obvious, and Sarah walked right into it anyway. "I can lead you through safely if conditions remain stable, but if they deteriorate..." Brandon cut her off. "Then we'll deal with it. That's what we're paying you for, right? To handle problems? Unless you think Marcus should take the lead, since he has more experience with extreme conditions." It was a direct challenge, and Sarah understood that if she backed down now, Brandon would use it as proof that she wasn't capable of handling difficult situations. And if she pushed forward and something went wrong, he'd blame her for making a reckless decision. She was caught either way, but the clients were watching her, trusting her to make the right call, and Tom was giving her a warning look that said this was a bad idea. "We'll go," Sarah said finally. "But we go by my rules, my pace, my route. Everyone follows my instructions exactly. No exceptions, no arguments. If conditions change, we turn back immediately." Agreed? She looked at each person until they nodded. Brandon and Marcus nodded last, and she could see the smug satisfaction in their faces. They thought they'd won. They thought this was about ego and control. They had no idea what they'd just signed up for. Sarah spent the next hour doing detailed safety checks, making sure everyone's avalanche beacons were working, reviewing their emergency protocols, marking safe zones on everyone's map. Tom pulled her aside as they were packing up. "Sarah, I have a bad feeling about this," he said quietly. "Those two are going to get someone hurt just to prove a point." Sarah shouldered her pack. "Then we'll make sure that someone is them, not the clients. Come on, let's go teach these boys about natural consequences." The route to the pass was beautiful and treacherous. Narrow trails above steep drop-offs, sections where they had to traverse snowfields, places where one wrong step could trigger a slide. Sarah moved carefully, testing each section before allowing the group to follow, placing markers, calling out warnings. The clients followed her instructions perfectly, moving with the kind of heightened attention that came from genuine understanding of the risks. Brandon and Marcus, however, kept trying to speed things up, making comments about Sarah being overly cautious, suggesting shortcuts that would have bypassed safety protocols. Sarah ignored them and focused on her job, getting everyone through safely. They were about 3 hours into the day's hike when they crested a ridge, and Sarah saw something that made her blood run cold. Fresh tracks in the snow, a large grizzly, maybe more than one, moving in the same direction they were headed. And not just moving, running, judging by the length of the stride. Bears didn't run unless they were chasing something or running from something, and either option was bad news for humans in their path. Sarah called for everyone to stop. "There's fresh bear activity ahead," she announced. "Recent, within the last hour. We need to evaluate whether to proceed." She was studying the tracks, trying to read the story they told, when Marcus pushed past her. "It's just tracks," he said dismissively. "The bear is probably miles away by now. This is exactly the kind of overcautious..." He didn't finish the sentence because that's when they heard it. The sound no wilderness traveler ever wants to hear. The low, rumbling growl of a very large, very angry bear somewhere close. Too close. Sarah's training kicked in instantly. "Everyone get your bear spray ready. Form a tight group. Make noise. Prepare to..." And then she saw it, coming around a stand of pines about 70 yards away. Not one grizzly. Two, a massive male and a female, and from the female's behavior, the laid-back ears, the aggressive posture, the way she kept circling back to something behind her, Sarah realized with sinking certainty what they'd stumbled into. Cubs. Somewhere nearby, there were cubs, and they just walked into the territory of a defensive mother grizzly, with a male that might see them as a threat to his breeding opportunity. "Back away slowly," Sarah commanded, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "Stay together, do not run. Tom, help me keep everyone." But Brandon wasn't listening. Brandon had seen the bears and made the single worst decision possible. He turned and ran. The sudden movement, the prey behavior, triggered exactly what Sarah had been trying to avoid. The female charged. 600 pounds of maternal fury, covering ground at 30 miles an hour. Faster than any human could possibly run, heading straight toward their group. Sarah had maybe 3 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether everyone lived or died. She could try to deploy her bear spray, but they were too far apart. The wind was wrong. It wouldn't stop the charge. She could try to make the group look bigger, more threatening, but the mother bear was past the point of intimidation. Or she could do the thing she'd been trained to do, the thing she'd hoped she'd never have to do, the thing that went against every instinct for self-preservation she had. She stepped forward, directly into the bear's path, putting herself between the charging grizzly and the clients. "Get back," she shouted at the group. "Tom, move them back now." And then she stood her ground, making herself as large as possible, holding her bear spray ready, and prepared to do whatever it took to protect the people she was responsible for. The bear closed the distance impossibly fast. 50 yards, 40, 30, and Sarah could see every detail, the rippling muscles, the foam at the mouth, the absolute commitment in those dark eyes. At 20 yards, Sarah deployed her spray, sending a cloud of capsaicin directly into the bear's face. The bear kept coming, momentum carrying it forward, even though it was shaking its head, clearly affected by the spray. At 10 yards, Sarah did the math in her head and knew she wasn't going to stop it. At 5 yards, she accepted that she was probably going to die, and her only thought was a calm hope that her parents would be taken care of, that Tom would get everyone else out safely, that her death would at least mean something. The impact, when it came, was like being hit by a truck. Sarah felt herself leave the ground, felt claws tearing through her jacket and into the flesh beneath, felt the crushing weight of the bear slamming her into the snow. She curled into a fetal position, the way she'd been trained, protecting her neck and vital organs, playing dead, even though every nerve was screaming at her to fight back. The bear was on top of her, growling, shaking her like a rag doll. Sarah felt ribs crack, felt her shoulders separate, felt warm blood soaking through her clothes. The pain was extraordinary, a white-hot agony that made her vision go gray at the edges. But she stayed limp, stayed still, even when the bear's teeth closed on her arm and she felt the bone break. She could hear shouting, Tom's voice, other voices, the sound of more bear spray being deployed. The weight on top of her shifted slightly. The bear shook her one more time, a final punctuation, then released her. Sarah stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, as the bear moved away. She could hear it retreating, could hear the sounds of cubs mewling, could hear human voices coming closer. She didn't move, not yet, not until she was absolutely sure it was over. "Sarah," Tom's voice, close now, urgent. "Jesus Christ, Sarah, stay with me." She felt hands on her, felt herself being moved, and the pain that shot through her body made her gasp despite her best efforts. "Don't move me," she managed to say through gritted teeth. Spinal protocol, could be damage. But Tom knew what he was doing. He was already checking her, his hands efficient and gentle, assessing injuries while keeping her as still as possible. Okay, I've got you. Brandon, get on the sat phone and call for emergency evac. Now." Sarah tried to focus, tried to take inventory of her injuries through the haze of pain and shock. Her left arm was definitely broken, possibly in multiple places. Several ribs were cracked at minimum, deep lacerations on her shoulder and back where the claws had torn through. Possible internal bleeding. Definitely going into shock. She could feel the trembling starting, the cold creeping in despite the adrenaline. "The clients," she whispered. "Everyone okay?" "Everyone's fine," Tom said, and his voice was shaking slightly. "You saved them all, you crazy brave woman. You saved everyone." Sarah tried to laugh, but it came out as more of a cough. "Documentary evidence," she said, the words taking tremendous effort. "That Brandon Whitmore doesn't know shit about wilderness safety." She could hear Brandon's voice in the background, panicked and shrill on the phone, and she felt a grim satisfaction that he was finally understanding the reality of what she'd been trying to teach him. Then the pain got to be too much, and the gray at the edges of her vision closed in completely, and Sarah Blackwater let herself sink into the darkness, trusting that Tom would handle things from here. Her last coherent thought was a strange mixture of regret and triumph. Regret that it had come to this, triumph that she'd protected her clients, that she'd done her job, that even Brandon Whitmore would have to acknowledge that she'd been right about everything that mattered. She woke up in bursts over the next hours, fragmentary moments of consciousness, the sound of a helicopter, the sensation of being lifted, a paramedic's voice asking her questions she couldn't quite process, the sterile smell of a hospital, her mother's face, tear-streaked and terrified, her father holding her uninjured hand with his oxygen tank beside the bed, Tom standing in the corner looking grim. She woke up fully 3 days later in Calgary General Hospital, her left arm in a complicated brace, her torso wrapped in bandages, her shoulder immobilized, and every single part of her body screaming with pain. The first thing she saw was her mother, asleep in a chair beside the bed, and the first thing she thought was that they definitely couldn't afford this hospital bill. The second thing she thought was whether she still had a job. The third thing she thought was that she'd survived. She'd actually survived a grisly attack, and that put her in a very small and select group of people. A nurse came in when she stirred, did all the standard checks, and then said, "You've had quite a lot of visitors. Should I start letting people in?" Sarah nodded, then regretted it when the movement sent pain shooting through her neck. Her mother woke up, immediately started fussing, and Sarah endured it with as much grace as she could manage because she knew her mom had been terrified. Her father came in shortly after, moving slowly with his oxygen tank, and he sat on the edge of the bed and spoke to her in Cree, telling her how proud he was, how strong she was, how she'd always had the spirit of a warrior. Tom visited next, bearing gifts of real coffee and contraband chocolate, and he filled her in on what had happened after she'd lost consciousness. "The helicopter got you out within 3 hours," he said. "You were in surgery for 7 hours. They had to rebuild your shoulder, set the arm bones with pins, repair internal damage. The doctor said you're lucky to be alive. The bear could have killed you easily." Sarah sipped the coffee carefully, her right hand shaky but functional. "The clients?" she asked. "All fine, scared but unharmed. Tom Chen, you remember him, the accountant from Red Deer? He said you were the bravest thing he'd ever seen. Said he's never going to forget how you stepped between them and the bear. They've all sent cards and flowers." Tom gestured to the windowsill, which Sarah now realized was covered in flower arrangements. "And there's been media attention, lots of it. You're kind of famous now." Sarah felt her stomach sink. "Media?" Tom nodded. "It's been all over the news. Heroic indigenous instructor saves clients from bear attack. CBC did a whole segment. CTV interviewed some of the clients. Your story has gone viral. There's video from someone's phone, shows you facing down the bear. It's incredible footage, Sarah. Terrifying, but incredible." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to process this. "What about Brandon?" she asked, dreading the answer. Tom's expression went hard. "Brandon is fucked," he said bluntly. "His father's PR team has been trying to do damage control, but it's not working. See, here's what happened. After the attack, after you were evacuated, the Parks Canada investigation team came in to document everything. They found evidence that Brandon had ignored multiple safety warnings, that he'd pressured you to proceed despite dangerous conditions, that his reckless behavior directly led to the encounter. The other clients gave statements. I gave a statement. Marcus gave a statement. And he threw Brandon under the bus completely, said it was all Brandon's decision, and he'd just been following orders." Tom's smile was sharp. Then someone, no one knows who, leaked internal emails to the media. Emails showing Brandon's campaign to undermine you, his plans to fire you, his pattern of dismissing safety concerns. CBC got hold of your safety reports, showing all the incidents you documented. And suddenly the narrative shifted from tragic accident to incompetent Nepo baby nearly kills people, including the indigenous woman trying to protect them. Sarah felt a strange mixture of emotions. Vindication, yes, but also exhaustion and a kind of sad resignation. "So I was right," she said quietly, "but it took me nearly dying to prove it." Tom reached over and squeezed her uninjured hand. "You were right about everything, and now everyone knows it. Mountain Edge fired Brandon 2 days ago. Well, technically he resigned, but it was clear he was about to be terminated. Marcus left the same day. The board of directors asked me to serve as interim director, and the first thing I did was offer you your job back with a significant raise and the title of Director of Curriculum and Safety, if you want it." Sarah looked at him. "If I want it? Tom, I can barely move. The doctors said I'll need months of physical therapy. I might never regain full mobility in my left shoulder. How am I supposed to lead wilderness courses when I can't even—" She stopped, feeling tears of frustration building. Tom waited patiently until she'd composed herself. "You can lead from your expertise," he said gently. "You can develop curriculum, train instructors, set safety standards, consult on difficult situations. You can do the work you've always been best at without having to personally lead every course. And when you're healed enough, if you want to get back into the field, that option will be there." But right now, what Mountain Edge needs most is your knowledge and your integrity. We need you to rebuild the program the right way. Over the next weeks, as Sarah slowly healed, the full extent of what had happened became clear. Brandon Whitmore had been more than just fired. He'd been professionally destroyed. His father's company distanced themselves from him. He was facing potential criminal charges for reckless endangerment. Marcus Sterling's consulting contract was terminated, and word spread quickly in the outdoor recreation industry about what had happened. Neither of them would work in wilderness education again. The clients from the trip had started a crowdfunding campaign to help with Sarah's medical expenses, and it had raised over $100,000, far more than the bills, which meant Sarah's parents could finally get the care they needed, could pay off debts, could breathe for the first time in years. The Cree Nation had honored her in a special ceremony, recognizing her courage and her representation of indigenous excellence. She'd been interviewed by national media, had become a voice for wilderness safety and indigenous knowledge, had been offered consulting positions and speaking engagements. But the thing that meant the most to Sarah happened 6 weeks after the attack, when she was finally released from the hospital and able to return home. She arrived to find that the community had come together in her absence. The reserve houses had been repaired, her parents' home had been winterized, and the electrical issues fixed. There was a new wood stove in the kitchen and a ramp for her father's oxygen tank. The community center had organized a feast in her honor, and elder after elder came to speak to her in Cree, telling her she'd made them proud, that she'd shown the world what their people were capable of, that she'd honored her ancestors. Her grandfather's name was mentioned, the old man who taught her the traditional ways, who died when she was 15, but whose lessons had stayed with her. They said he would have been proud of how she'd faced the bear, how she'd put others before herself, how she demonstrated the kind of courage that couldn't be bought or faked. Sarah stood in front of the community, her arm still in a sling, her body still aching, and she spoke in Cree about what the experience had taught her. She talked about how the wilderness was a teacher, how it showed you who you really were, how it didn't care about money or status or anything except your actual skills and character. She talked about how bears weren't monsters, but wild animals deserving of respect, how the mother bear had been protecting her cubs, just like Sarah had been protecting her clients, how there was honor in that, even if the outcome was violent. She talked about how the incident had proven what indigenous people had always known, that survival required humility, respect for the land, and genuine knowledge passed down through generations. And she talked about how she'd almost lost everything she'd worked for to a man who'd never had to work for anything, how the system was designed to favor people like Brandon Whitmore, but how ultimately the truth had a way of coming out. Some people asked me if I hate the bear that attacked me, Sarah said, her voice carrying across the silent room. And my answer is no. That bear was doing what bears do. She was protecting her young. If anything, I respect her more now than I did before. The bear was honest. The bear didn't lie or manipulate or hide behind money and power. The bear was exactly what she appeared to be. Dangerous, yes, but authentic. It's the human predators you have to watch out for, the ones who smile while they're destroying you, the ones who use their privilege as a weapon. Those are the ones who deserve your anger. She paused, looking out at her community. Brandon Whitmore tried to take everything from me because he couldn't stand that someone like me, a native woman from the reserve, knew more than him and was better than him at something that mattered. He used every tool he had to undermine me, to push me out, to prove I didn't belong. And in the end, all of that privilege and power and money couldn't save him from the consequences of his own incompetence and arrogance. The community erupted in cheers and applause, and Sarah felt something shift inside her, a burden she'd been carrying for years finally lifting. She realized that she'd spent so much of her life trying to prove she was good enough, trying to meet standards set by people who'd never wanted her to succeed in the first place, trying to play by rules designed to keep her in her place. But she was done with that now. She'd literally faced death and survived, had put her body between danger and the people she was responsible for, had proven beyond any doubt what she was capable of. She didn't need Brandon Whitmore's approval or anyone else's. She just needed to keep doing what she'd always done, teaching people to respect the wilderness, honoring her ancestors' knowledge, protecting those who needed protecting. 3 months after the attack, Sarah returned to work at Mountain Edge, now officially as Director of Curriculum and Safety. Her left arm was still weak, her shoulder still required physical therapy, and she tired more easily than before. But she could think and plan and teach, and that was what mattered. She completely overhauled the safety protocols, implemented mandatory training for all instructors, created a comprehensive bear awareness program that became the industry standard across Western Canada. She worked with Parks Canada to develop better signage and education materials. She mentored a new generation of instructors, particularly Indigenous youth who wanted to work in outdoor education but didn't see themselves represented in the field. She turned down interview requests and speaking engagements that felt exploitative and accepted ones that allowed her to speak about real issues: Indigenous land rights, environmental stewardship, the commercialization of wilderness recreation, the need for authentic expertise over celebrity personalities. Marcus Sterling had tried to reach out to her once, through email, with what might have been an apology, or might have been an attempt to rehabilitate his own image. Sarah deleted it without responding. Brandon Whitmore never contacted her directly, though she'd heard through the industry grapevine that he'd moved to Toronto and was working in his father's corporate office, far from any wilderness he might be called upon to actually navigate. His father had tried to settle with her quietly, offering a substantial sum of money in exchange for her signature on a non-disclosure agreement. Sarah's lawyer had laughed and sent back a counteroffer that was triple the amount with no NDA attached. The Whitmores had paid without argument, and Sarah had used the money to establish a scholarship fund for Indigenous students pursuing careers in environmental sciences and wilderness recreation. 1 year after the attack, on a cool morning in May, Sarah led her first wilderness course since the incident. It wasn't the advanced course, she wasn't ready for that yet physically, but rather the basic intro course she'd been teaching for years. 12 students gathered at the trailhead, and Sarah stood before them feeling nervous for the first time in her career. She'd been attacked by a grizzly bear and survived, but somehow standing in front of these students again, being responsible for their safety and their learning, felt more daunting. She'd had nightmares about failing them, about her injuries making her unable to protect them, about the trauma of the attack leaving her too cautious or too reckless. But as she started her opening talk, explaining what they'd be learning and why it mattered, she felt the old confidence returning. This was who she was. This was what she did. The bear attack hadn't taken that away from her. They practiced fire starting, and Sarah demonstrated the bow drill method. Her left arm still not quite strong enough for the repetitive motion, but her knowledge and teaching ability undiminished. They built shelters, and she explained the principles behind each design. They learned navigation, and she shared stories about the land that her grandfather had told her. And when they got to the wildlife awareness section, Sarah took a deep breath and told them about her attack. She showed them the scars on her arm where the bear's teeth had broken through. She explained exactly what she'd done right and what she'd done wrong. She talked about the moment of decision when she'd chosen to step between the bear and her clients, and why that was the only choice she could have made. She talked about the aftermath, the pain, and the fear, and the long recovery, but also about the strange gift the experience had given her: absolute certainty about who she was and what she stood for. The wilderness will test you, she told them, these 12 strangers who'd trusted her with their safety and their learning. It will show you who you really are when all the bullshit is stripped away. It will reveal your courage and your cowardice, your strength and your weakness, your integrity and your selfishness. Some people can't handle that kind of truth. They want the wilderness to be a stage where they can perform, a backdrop for their social media posts, a place to prove their dominance. But the wilderness doesn't care about your performance. It demands authenticity. And if you can't give it that, if you can't approach it with humility and respect and genuine understanding, it will break you. She paused, remembering Brandon Whitmore's face when he'd seen the charging bear, the terror and the sudden understanding that his money couldn't save him. I've seen people broken by their own arrogance, she continued. I've seen people whose privilege made them believe they were invincible, and I've watched the wilderness teach them otherwise. It's not a gentle teacher, but it's a fair one. Out here, we're all equal. The CEO and the dishwasher, the PhD and the high school dropout. None of that matters when you're facing a grizzly bear or a whiteout or a cliff edge. What matters is what you actually know, what you can actually do, who you actually are. The students listened with an intensity that Sarah recognized. The intensity of people who understood they were being given something real, something valuable, something that transcended the mere exchange of money for services. After the course ended, several of them approached her to thank her, and one woman, a lawyer from Edmonton, who'd mentioned she was going through a difficult divorce, said something that stuck with Sarah. "I came here thinking I'd learn how to build a fire and read a map," the woman said. "But what I'm leaving with is the understanding that I don't have to let people who have more power than me define my worth. You proved that. You almost died proving it, and I'm sorry that happened to you, but thank you for showing us what real strength looks like." Sarah drove home that evening, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but peace. The kind of peace that came from knowing you'd survived the worst thing you could imagine and come out the other side still yourself. She stopped at her parents' house, found them in the kitchen making dinner in their warm, properly lit, properly heated home, and she sat with them and spoke in Cree about her day. Her father's cough had improved with proper medication. Her mother's arthritis was manageable with the treatments she could finally afford. They were okay. They were going to be okay. And so was Sarah. Over the following years, Sarah's reputation grew beyond the wilderness education community. She became a sought-after expert on outdoor safety, a consultant for Parks Canada and the Canadian Wildlife Service, an advocate for Indigenous land rights and traditional ecological knowledge. She trained park rangers and search and rescue teams. She wrote a book about wilderness survival that became required reading in outdoor recreation programs across North America. She testified before Parliament about the importance of Indigenous involvement in environmental management. She never became wealthy. That wasn't her goal. But she was comfortable, and more importantly, she was respected. People listened when she spoke. They took her knowledge seriously. They understood that she'd earned her expertise through years of dedicated study and practice, through listening to elders and learning from the land, through facing death and choosing to protect others despite the cost. Brandon Whitmore's name came up occasionally in industry circles, usually as a cautionary tale about nepotism and the danger of putting unqualified people in positions of authority. Sarah heard that he'd gotten married, had kids, was living a comfortable corporate life in Toronto. She didn't hate him. Hatred required more energy than he was worth, but she also didn't forgive him. He'd tried to destroy her career out of spite and insecurity, had put lives at risk including his own, and had only faced consequences because Sarah had been willing to put her body between his mistakes and the people those mistakes could have killed. That wasn't something that earned forgiveness. It was something that earned indifference. He was irrelevant to her life now, a footnote in a story that had turned out to be about her strength rather than his weakness. The bear that had attacked her became something of a legend in the outdoor community. Parks Canada had tracked her. They'd confirmed it was a female protecting 2 cubs, and she'd lived in the area for several more years before eventually dying of natural causes at the age of 27, which was old for a grizzly. Sarah heard about it from a park ranger friend and felt an unexpected wave of sadness. That bear had changed her life, had nearly killed her, but Sarah understood now that the bear had just been doing what bears do, protecting what mattered to her. There was honor in that, even if it had come with a terrible cost. Sarah had a photo of a grizzly, not the one that attacked her, but one similar, on her office wall at Mountain Edge, and sometimes students asked about it. She'd tell them the story, not to make herself seem heroic, but to make a point about respect and responsibility, and what it meant to work in wild spaces. On the 5-year anniversary of the attack, Sarah led a special advanced course that retraced part of the route where the incident had occurred. She'd been planning it for a year, working with Parks Canada to ensure it was safe, preparing herself mentally and physically for the return. Tom Ryder accompanied her, along with 6 experienced students who understood the significance of the trip. When they reached the area where the attack had happened, Sarah stopped the group and stood silent for a long moment, remembering. The clearing looked different now. The trees had grown, the snowpack had changed. The area where she'd fallen was just another patch of forest floor, but she could still feel it, the ghost of that terror and pain and desperate courage. "I almost died here," she told the group, "and for a while afterward, I thought that meant I'd failed somehow, that I'd made a mistake that nearly cost me everything. But I understand now that I didn't fail. I did exactly what I was supposed to do. I protected the people I was responsible for. I used my knowledge and training, and I survived. That's not failure. That's success under the worst possible circumstances. She looked at each student in turn. Some of you will face moments in your lives when you have to choose between what's easy and what's right, between protecting yourself and protecting others, between going along with powerful people or standing up for what matters. And I want you to remember this place and this story. I want you to remember that sometimes the right choice is the dangerous choice. Sometimes honor requires sacrifice. Sometimes standing up to bullies means risking everything. But it's worth it. It's always worth it. They stood together in that clearing, 6 students and 2 instructors, in the place where Sarah Blackwater had faced down 600 pounds of maternal fury and survived. And Sarah felt a sense of closure, of completion that she hadn't known she needed. She'd come full circle, back to the place where she'd been broken and remade, where she'd proven to herself and everyone else exactly what she was made of. As they hiked back toward the trailhead that afternoon, Sarah walked with Tom at the rear of the group. "You ever regret it?" Tom asked quietly. "Stepping in front of that bear, given how much it cost you?" Sarah thought about it seriously, because Tom deserved a serious answer. She thought about the pain and the fear and the long recovery. She thought about the nightmares she still had sometimes, waking up feeling claws in her back and teeth on her arm. She thought about how her left shoulder still ached in cold weather, how she'd never regain full strength in that arm, how she'd carry the physical scars for the rest of her life. But then she thought about those 12 clients who'd gone home safe to their families. She thought about how her stand had exposed Brandon Whitmore's incompetence and prevented him from hurting anyone else. She thought about the indigenous students she'd mentored, who now had a role model showing them they belonged in this field. She thought about the changes to wilderness safety protocols that would protect future students. She thought about her parents in their warm house with proper medical care. "No," Sarah said finally. "I don't regret it. I wish it hadn't been necessary. I wish Brandon had been competent enough that it never came to that. I wish our society didn't create people like him, people who think money and privilege make them better than everyone else, people who are willing to endanger others to protect their ego. But given the situation I was in, given the choice I had to make, I'd do it again. Because that's who I am. That's who I've always been, and no bear attack was going to change that." Tom nodded, satisfied with the answer. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, following the trail as it wound down through the pines, the evening light turning everything golden. Ahead, the students were talking and laughing, confident in their skills, secure in the knowledge that they were being led by someone who knew what she was doing. Sarah listened to their voices and felt that deep satisfaction that came from work well done, from knowledge passed on, from honor maintained, despite all pressures to compromise. What would you have done in Sarah's position? When you're being pushed out of a job you love, when someone with more power is trying to destroy you just because they can, do you fight back or do you accept it? Do you walk away or do you stand your ground? Sarah chose to stand, and it nearly killed her, but it also saved lives and exposed corruption and proved that expertise and integrity matter more than privilege and money. If you believe that courage means standing up for what's right, even when it costs you everything, please like and subscribe. Share this story with anyone who's ever felt powerless against systems designed to protect the powerful, because sometimes the wilderness teaches lessons that extend far beyond the forest. Sarah Blackwater continued her work for many more years, becoming one of the most respected voices in wilderness education. She trained hundreds of instructors, influenced policy at the national level, and never compromised on safety or ethics. She eventually met someone, a park ranger, who understood her work and respected her strength, and built a quiet, fulfilling life that balanced her passion for the wilderness with the human connections she needed. She never forgot the lesson that Grizzly Bear taught her, the lesson that Brandon Whitmore learned too late, that in the wilderness and in life, what matters isn't how much money you have or what your last name is. What matters is what you know, what you can do, and who you choose to be when everything is on the line. Sarah chose courage. She chose honor. She chose to protect others at tremendous cost to herself. And that choice made all the difference. The true measure of strength isn't dominating others or accumulating power. It's using whatever capability you have to protect those who need protecting. It's standing between danger and the vulnerable, even when that puts you in harm's way. It's refusing to let bullies win, even when fighting back costs you everything. Sarah Blackwater embodied that kind of strength, and her story stands as proof that sometimes the smallest person in the room, the person everyone underestimates, the person from the wrong background with the wrong last name, turns out to be the hero the situation requires. Not because they're trying to be heroic, but because they're simply doing what's right. And in the end, that's what true courage looks like. Not the absence of fear, but the commitment to others that transcends self-preservation. Remember Sarah's story the next time you face your own metaphorical grizzly bear, whether that's a workplace bully, a corrupt system, or any situation where doing the right thing requires risking something important. Remember that the wilderness doesn't lie, that authentic skill and genuine integrity will always matter more than borrowed power, and that sometimes the only way to teach certain lessons is to let natural consequences run their course. Stay safe out there, respect the wilderness, and never let anyone tell you that you don't belong somewhere you've earned the right to be. The frost came early that year, coating the windows of Riverside High School with crystalline patterns that caught the morning light like fractured diamonds. And through one of those windows, a girl named Sarah Chen watched the parking lot fill with vehicles that told the story of the town's brutal economic divide. Dented pickups with rust eating through the wheel wells, sedans held together with duct tape and prayer, and then the luxury vehicles, the BMWs and Mercedes, and that cherry red Mustang that belonged to Marcus Holloway, son of Judge Richard Holloway, king of the school, and terror of anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of worthwhile humanity. Sarah was 17, a junior, and she'd been at Riverside for exactly 6 weeks. Transferred in on a hardship scholarship after her father's injury at the logging mill left their family with medical bills that consumed everything except the bare minimum needed to survive. She was small for her age, barely 5'2", with straight black hair she kept in a practical ponytail and clothes from the discount store that she wore without shame because her mother had taught her that dignity came from within, not from labels stitched on fabric. What nobody at Riverside knew yet was that Sarah had spent the previous summer training with her father, learning the discipline he'd acquired during his 2 tours in Iraq before an IED damaged his spine and sent him home to logging work that eventually destroyed what the war hadn't finished. Every morning at 5, before her father's pain made movement impossible, they'd work together in their garage, conditioning, technique, the mental focus that separated survivors from victims. She kept her head down those first weeks, navigating the hostile hallways with the situational awareness her father had drilled into her, noting exits and potential threats, understanding that the worst predators were the ones who smiled while they circled. She ate lunch alone, reading books she'd checked out from the library because buying them was impossible, and she watched. She watched Marcus Holloway hold court in the cafeteria, surrounded by his followers, Chad Peterson, whose father owned the car dealerships, Brittany Walsh, whose mother was on the school board, Derek Santos, who was Marcus's enforcer despite being scholarship student himself, bought and paid for with the promise of protection and reflected glory. She watched how other students moved around Marcus like water flowing around a boulder, how teachers looked away when his voice rose in cruelty, how even Principal Davidson seemed to flinch when Judge Holloway appeared at school events with his cold eyes and his expensive suits, and his unspoken reminder that he could destroy careers with a phone call. Sarah helped Mrs. Patterson, the elderly cafeteria worker, carry heavy trash bags to the dumpster, even when other students walked past without seeing. She stayed after class to help Mr. Reeves, the physics teacher, set up lab equipment because she understood that small kindnesses built the kind of relationships that mattered when everything else crumbled. She walked home every afternoon through neighborhoods where the houses got progressively smaller and more run down, past the soup kitchen where her mother volunteered 3 nights a week, past the Veterans Hall where her father played chess with other broken soldiers, past the mechanic shop where Danny Rodriguez worked evenings to support his grandmother, a man in his 30s who'd served with her father and who nodded to Sarah with the kind of respect that acknowledged shared understanding of sacrifice. Her daily routine began at 5:30 when she helped her father with his physical therapy, his face twisted with pain he tried to hide, his hand shaking as he pushed through exercises that would never truly heal him but might keep him from getting worse. She made breakfast for both parents, packed lunches with whatever food stamps and her mother's part-time cleaning jobs could provide. and walked the 3 miles to school because the bus route didn't reach their neighborhood and gas was too expensive to waste. She studied during every free moment because the scholarship required maintaining a 3.8 GPA, and she knew that education was the only ladder out of poverty, the only weapon against the Marcus Holloways of the world, who'd been handed everything and learned nothing except entitlement. She helped her mother clean houses on weekends, scrubbing toilets in the homes of people who treated them like furniture, and she never complained because she learned from her father that dignity meant doing what needed to be done without whining about fairness or justice. The hostile environment at Riverside was obvious but unspoken, the way certain students could miss class without consequences, while others got detention for being 60 seconds late. The way athletic budgets ballooned while the arts program survived on bake sales. The way discipline was a weapon wielded selectively against those without powerful parents. Sarah navigated it all with careful neutrality, speaking when spoken to, volunteering for extra credit, staying invisible in the spaces where predators hunted. She saw how they operated. The Marcuses and Chads and Brittnys, how they selected targets based on vulnerability and lack of protection, how they tested boundaries with small cruelties before escalating to systematic destruction. She watched them corner Jamie Sullivan, a freshman with developmental delays, and mock him until he cried, and she intervened with quiet firmness, leading Jamie away while Marcus laughed and called her a bleeding heart do-gooder who'd learn her place soon enough. She found a kitten in a dumpster behind the school, half-starved and covered in fleas, and she wrapped it in her jacket and took it to the vet clinic, where Dr. Morrison treated animals for people who couldn't pay full price, and she worked there 2 afternoons a week cleaning cages and doing intake paperwork in exchange for the kitten's care. She named him Sergeant, after her father's best friend, who died pulling wounded soldiers from a burning vehicle, and she brought him home in a cardboard box, where he became her father's companion, curling up on his lap during the bad pain days, offering the kind of uncomplicated affection that humans often couldn't manage. Her mother said it was just like Sarah to rescue things, to believe that kindness mattered in a world that rewarded cruelty. And her father said that compassion was its own kind of strength, that the hardest thing in combat wasn't pulling a trigger, but maintaining humanity when everything pushed you toward darkness. Danny Rodriguez became an unexpected mentor, this tattooed veteran with grease under his fingernails and eyes that had seen too much, who taught Sarah about cars and machinery and the way systems could be understood through patient observation. He'd known her father in Fallujah, had carried him to the medevac after the IED, and he treated Sarah with the protective affection of an uncle who recognized potential and wanted to nurture it. He taught her about engines and transmissions, about how understanding how things worked gave you power over them, about how the wealthy stayed wealthy by keeping others ignorant and dependent. He showed her the Mustang Marcus drove, explained how much it cost, did the math on how many hours a minimum wage worker would need to labor to afford those leather seats, that premium sound system, that casual display of excess in a town where families chose between heat and food. The support system Sarah built was quiet and strong. Her parents, who loved her fiercely despite their poverty. Danny, who taught her practical skills and the veteran's mindset of mission-focused determination. Mrs. Patterson, who saved extra food for Sarah to take home. Mr. Reeves, who wrote letters of recommendation and encouraged her scientific aptitude. Dr. Morrison, who saw her dedication and offered more hours at better pay. They were the invisible network that privilege never noticed. The people who did essential work and got no recognition, who held communities together while the powerful took credit and consumed resources. Sarah understood that her strength came from them, from their example of endurance and dignity, from the way they faced each day's challenges without the cushion of safety nets or second chances. She moved through Riverside High with a grace that came from discipline, her posture straight, her expression neutral, her awareness complete. She knew which bathrooms to avoid during certain periods, which hallways Marcus and his crew controlled, which teachers would intervene and which would look away. She documented everything in a journal she kept hidden, noting dates and times and witnesses, building a record without quite knowing why, except that her father had taught her that intelligence gathering was the foundation of any successful operation. She photographed the parking lot disparities, the cafeteria waste from the wealthy students' untouched lunches, the crumbling textbooks in some classrooms, while others had new smartboards. She was building something without fully understanding what, creating a foundation that would prove crucial when everything inevitably exploded. Marcus Holloway noticed her eventually, because predators always noticed when prey refused to show fear, when someone moved through their territory without the proper deference. He saw this small Asian girl who didn't giggle when he walked past, who didn't compete for his attention, who seemed to exist in some parallel universe where his power meant nothing, and it irritated him the way a small stone and expensive shoes created disproportionate discomfort. He started with small tests, shoulder-checking her in the hallway, making comments about her discount store clothes, asking loudly if she was one of those scholarship charity cases who needed handouts to pretend they belonged. Sarah absorbed it all without reaction, her face calm, her eyes meeting his, with something that wasn't defiance exactly, but wasn't submission either. And that made Marcus angrier, because his entire identity was built on reactions, on making people flinch and cringe and acknowledge his dominance. The world before the storm was deceptively quiet. Those weeks in October, when the leaves turned gold and red, and the mountains beyond town wore their first snow like warnings of harder times ahead, Sarah studied and worked and helped her family, building the kind of character that came from facing adversity without becoming bitter, from maintaining moral codes when breaking them would be easier. She was kind to the unkind, helpful to the helpless, honest when lies would have been convenient, and she did it all while carrying the weight of her family's struggles with a strength that never occurred to people like Marcus, who'd never carried anything heavier than their own egos. She was everything he would never be, and on some level he recognized that, and it made him hate her with the irrational intensity of someone confronted with their own inadequacy. Marcus Holloway was 18 years old and 6'2", with the kind of casual good looks that came from generations of selective breeding among the wealthy, all strong jaw and clear skin and teeth straightened by orthodontics that cost more than Sarah's family earned in a year. His father, Judge Richard Holloway, had presided over the county court for 15 years. His mother Margaret sat on every important charity board. Their house on Riverside Drive had 8 bedrooms and a pool that heated through Montana winters. Marcus drove the Mustang his parents had bought him for his 17th birthday, wore clothes with designer labels, carried the newest iPhone, and understood, at a cellular level, that rules were suggestions that applied to other people. He'd grown up in a world where consequences were things that happened to the poor, where a phone call from his father could make problems disappear, where his future was already secured. Acceptance to his father's alma mater, a position in a prestigious firm, marriage to someone appropriately wealthy, a life of comfort and power stretching endlessly forward. His entourage reflected the social hierarchy of Riverside, like a perfect microcosm of American inequality. Chad Peterson, whose father owned 3 car dealerships, and who served as Marcus's wingman in all cruelties, always ready with a laugh or a cruel quip, desperate for approval from someone even richer and more powerful. Brittany Walsh, blonde and beautiful, and mean as a snake, whose mother's position on the school board made her untouchable, who led the social destruction of any girl who threatened her position as Marcus's occasional girlfriend. Derek Santos, the scholarship student who'd sold his soul for protection, who came from poverty but had learned to despise his origins, who did Marcus's physical enforcement with the zeal of a convert, proving his loyalty. Then there was Jessica Park and Tyler Chen, both Asian like Sarah, both from wealthy families who'd climbed the ladder and pulled it up behind them, who were especially vicious towards Sarah because her poverty reflected origins they wanted desperately to forget. Marcus's pattern of cruelty had been established since middle school, identifying vulnerability and exploiting it with systematic precision, destroying reputations and self-esteem with the kind of casual viciousness that wealthy teenagers perfected in exclusive prep schools and affluent suburbs. He'd driven 3 students to transfer schools, gotten 2 teachers fired by orchestrating complaints through his mother's connections, and left a trail of psychological damage that nobody with power cared to acknowledge. His first major incident at Riverside had involved Tommy Nguyen, a sophomore whose family ran a nail salon, whose father's English was imperfect, whose poverty was absolute. Marcus had orchestrated a campaign of racist harassment that culminated in Tommy's locker being vandalized with slurs, his belongings destroyed, his parents' business targeted with fake negative reviews until they nearly went under. Principal Davidson had called it boys being boys, and suggested Tommy might be more comfortable at another school. But there was something beneath Marcus's cruelty that made it more complex than simple sadism, a hidden weakness that those who looked closely could sometimes glimpse. His father, Judge Holloway, was a man who believed affection was weakness and love was manipulation, who'd raised Marcus with impossible standards and casual contempt, who praised only perfection and punished anything less with cold disapproval. Marcus's mother was an alcoholic who hid bottles in her closet and smiled through charity events while slowly dying inside, who'd long ago surrendered any attempt at protecting her son from his father's emotional brutality. Marcus had learned early that vulnerability invited exploitation, that showing weakness meant being crushed, that the only safety was in being the most dangerous thing in the room. He was a victim creating victims, perpetuating cycles of abuse because he'd never learned any other way to exist, though this explanation didn't excuse his actions. It only contextualized them, showed the tragic machinery that created monsters from wounded children. The corrupt adults who enabled him formed an interlocking network of power and protection. Principal Davidson, who owed his position to Judge Holloway's influence. Sheriff Brennan, who played golf with Marcus's father and understood that certain families got different justice. Coach Williams, who overlooked Marcus's violations because the Holloways donated generously to the athletic department. Mrs. Walsh, whose position on the school board made her both Marcus's girlfriend's mother and the person who approved discipline policies. They formed a wall around Marcus, a fortress of privilege that rendered him functionally untouchable, that allowed him to operate with impunity, while teachers and students who complained found themselves transferred, demoted, or simply made to understand that resistance was futile and collaboration was survival. Marcus's first attack on Sarah came in early November, 3 weeks after she'd humiliated him by not reacting to his initial provocations. He'd orchestrated it carefully, waiting until she was walking home past the municipal park, where his crew often gathered, where cameras didn't reach and witnesses could be controlled. They surrounded her casually, 5 of them forming a loose circle, while Marcus stepped forward with that smile that never reached his eyes. He offered her a ride home in his Mustang, made it sound like kindness, like he was extending charity to this poor scholarship girl who had to walk everywhere. Sarah looked at him with those calm eyes and said, "No thank you." She preferred walking, and the rejection in front of his friends made Marcus's face flush with anger he barely controlled. He called her an ungrateful refugee who should learn to show proper respect to her betters, and Sarah said nothing, just walked around him with that infuriating dignity, leaving him standing there like a fool while his crew exchanged uncomfortable glances. The dignity of her response gnawed at Marcus more than any insult could have, because it demonstrated a kind of strength he didn't understand. A power that didn't rely on domination or cruelty or the accumulated advantages of wealth. She'd made him look weak without raising her voice or throwing an insult, simply by refusing to acknowledge that he had any power over her at all. He watched her walk away, this small figure in her discount store jacket, and felt something like fear mixed with his rage. Fear that maybe his whole identity was built on foundations as fragile as the respect he commanded through intimidation rather than earned through character. But Marcus had never learned to process complex emotions, had never been taught to examine his feelings or question his entitlement. So the fear transformed into fury, and the fury demanded expression through the only channels he knew, escalating violence designed to break her and prove his dominance. The incidents began small and grew like cancers, each one carefully calculated to inflict maximum damage while maintaining plausible deniability. The first was her locker being vandalized with racial slurs spray-painted across the metal, done during a weekend when cameras were conveniently turned off for maintenance. Reported to Principal Davidson, who made sympathetic noises and did nothing because there was no proof, and boys will be boys, and maybe Sarah should consider whether she was being overly sensitive. She cleaned the slurs herself, using solvent Danny gave her, working methodically while other students whispered and stared, and her face showed nothing but calm concentration as she removed every trace of hate from the metal surface. The second incident came 2 weeks later when her backpack disappeared from her gym locker during PE class, found hours later in the dumpster behind the school with her textbooks destroyed by bleach, her notebooks shredded, her laptop, the refurbished one her parents had saved months to buy, smashed beyond repair. The cost to replace everything was more than her family had. so she borrowed textbooks from Mr. Reeves, took notes on borrowed paper, did her computer work at the library on machines that were slow and temperamental. She filed a police report because her father insisted, and Sheriff Brennan took her statement with a sympathetic smile that never reached his eyes, promised to investigate, and did absolutely nothing because Judge Holloway had already called to suggest that certain scholarship students might be creating drama for attention. The third incident was worse because it was public, designed for maximum humiliation in front of the maximum audience. Marcus waited until the cafeteria was packed, then orchestrated a scene where Brittany Walsh accidentally dumped a full tray of food on Sarah, spaghetti with meat sauce, chocolate pudding, orange juice, all of it landing on her clothes and hair, while 300 students watched. Brittany's apology was loud and theatrical and utterly insincere, offering to pay for cleaning at a dry cleaner that cost $50 per item, knowing Sarah couldn't afford it, making the charity offer part of the humiliation. Sarah stood there covered in food while the cafeteria erupted in laughter, and she looked at Brittany with those calm eyes and said, "It was okay, accidents happened," then walked to the bathroom to clean herself as best she could with paper towels and cold water. She wore the stained clothes for the rest of the day because she had no others, and she held her head high while whispers followed her through every hallway. The fourth incident introduced technology to the harassment, showing how modern cruelty could spread at digital speed. Everyone knew it was Marcus's crew, but proving it was impossible, created a fake social media profile for Sarah, filled with doctored photographs that made her look promiscuous and desperate, with posts claiming she was selling sexual favors to pay for school, with friend requests sent to everyone at Riverside and tagged with her real name. The posts spread through the student body in hours, and by lunch the next day, Sarah was being called a whore and a prostitute, was receiving messages from boys offering money for services she'd never offered, was being stared at and whispered about, and judged for things she'd never done. She reported it to the social media company, filed complaints, but the damage was done, and the profile kept reappearing under new names, each version more vicious than the last. Each incident showed Sarah's restraint and the system's failure in perfect inverse proportion. The more she demonstrated dignity and self-control, the more obviously the adults in charge failed to protect her or hold anyone accountable. Teachers saw the harassment and looked away. Fellow students who might have spoken up stayed silent because they didn't want to become targets themselves. Administrators made sympathetic noises and did nothing because challenging Marcus meant challenging his father, meant putting their careers at risk. The moral cowardice was absolute and depressing, a perfect demonstration of how systems designed to protect the vulnerable actually served to shield the powerful from consequences. Marcus's confidence grew with each successful attack, fed by the lack of consequences and his crew's constant reinforcement that he was justified, that Sarah was the problem for not knowing her place, that breaking her was not just acceptable but necessary to maintain the social order. He talked openly about his plans to destroy her, to make her leave Riverside, to teach every scholarship student and poor kid and outsider that this was his school and his town, and challenging him meant annihilation. His followers laughed and encouraged him, each one complicit in the escalating campaign, each one too invested in the hierarchy to question whether what they were doing was monstrously wrong. But there were moments when witnesses did nothing that revealed the true cost of cowardice. Mr. Henderson watching Marcus shove Sarah into lockers and turning away. Mrs. Rodriguez seeing Brittany destroying Sarah's art project and pretending not to notice. Coach Williams hearing Derek threaten Sarah and calling it competitive spirit. Every adult who looked away, every student who witnessed cruelty and said nothing, every moment of silence in the face of obvious wrongdoing built the foundation for tragedy, created the conditions where monsters thrived, because good people couldn't find the courage to speak. The line was finally crossed in late January during a snowstorm that closed roads and left Riverside feeling isolated and claustrophobic. Sarah's father had been hospitalized after a bad fall, his spine damage worsening to the point where surgery might be necessary, surgery they absolutely couldn't afford even with his veterans' benefits. Sarah was distracted, exhausted from hospital visits, and helping her mother with everything, running on 3 hours of sleep and stress that would have broken someone less disciplined. Marcus saw the vulnerability and decided to exploit it, planned an attack designed to break her completely, and finally extract the submission he'd been seeking for months. He cornered her after school in the parking lot when most students had left, when the snow was falling hard enough to obscure visibility and muffle sound. Chad and Derek were with him, blocking escape routes, and Marcus pulled out his phone to record what happened next, because he wanted proof of his dominance, wanted to be able to replay her breaking over and over. He started with insults about her father, called him a crippled welfare case who should have died in Iraq, called her mother a cleaning lady prostitute who serviced rich men in their homes, called Sarah a charity case who didn't deserve to breathe the same air as real Americans. He got close, invading her space, pushing boundaries to provoke a reaction that would justify what came next. Sarah stood perfectly still, her face calm despite the tears that started sliding down her cheeks. Not tears of fear, but tears of exhaustion and grief and rage, held so tightly controlled, it was like watching a bomb that hadn't yet decided to explode. She said nothing, gave him nothing, and that made Marcus angrier because he needed her to react, needed her to fight back so he could escalate with justification. So he did something he'd never quite done before. He grabbed her backpack, the replacement one Danny had given her, the one containing her father's dog tags that she carried everywhere, the one sacred object she possessed that connected her to the man who taught her everything about strength and honor. He held the backpack over his head, taunting her, telling her to jump for it like a good little refugee. And when she still didn't react, he opened it and pulled out the dog tags and threw them as hard as he could into the snowdrift beyond the parking lot, into the darkness where finding them would be nearly impossible. And that was when something changed in Sarah's eyes, when the calm cracked just enough to show the fury beneath, when Marcus realized he might have finally gone too far, but his ego wouldn't let him stop. He laughed and told her to go fetch like a good dog, and Sarah looked at him with an expression that should have terrified him, but he was too drunk on his own power to recognize danger when it stared him in the face. She walked past him without a word, into the snowdrift, searching for her father's dog tags in the dark, while Marcus and his crew drove away laughing, recording everything, already posting clips to social media with captions about teaching charity cases their place. Sarah searched for 2 hours in the freezing snow, her hands going numb, her body shaking with cold, and she finally found the dog tags buried 6 inches deep, covered in ice, and she held them against her chest and cried because she was exhausted and alone, and the world felt impossibly cruel and unfair. But here's what Marcus didn't know, what none of them knew, what nobody at Riverside had bothered to discover about this quiet girl who cleaned toilets and studied physics and kept her head down while absorbing every insult and injury with apparent passivity. Sarah's father had been an Army Ranger, decorated for valor, trained in close-quarters combat and tactical operations, and every morning for the past 3 years, he'd been teaching her everything he knew, training her not just physically, but mentally, teaching her patience and discipline, and the kind of cold calculation that separated amateurs from professionals. The restraint she'd shown wasn't weakness. It was the professional courtesy of someone who could destroy her opponents, but chose not to because her father had taught her that true strength meant protecting others, not proving dominance. Danny Rodriguez had served in the same unit, and he'd been supplementing Sarah's training with practical skills, surveillance, documentation, strategic planning, understanding how to build cases that would hold up under scrutiny. Every incident Sarah had endured, she documented with photographs, witness statements, saved messages, building a file that was comprehensive and damning. She'd gathered allies carefully, other victims of Marcus's cruelty, who were too afraid to speak alone but might find courage in numbers. Veterans from the VFW who believed in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Teachers like Mr. Reeves, who'd been waiting for someone brave enough to challenge the system. Even a lawyer named Catherine Morrison, who did pro bono work for low-income families, and who happened to be Danny's sister. The protagonist's hidden advantage began to reveal itself in small ways that Marcus was too arrogant to notice. Sarah started carrying a small camera that Danny had given her, documenting every interaction, every threat, building a video record that was time-stamped and stored in cloud backups beyond Marcus's reach. She reached out to Jamie Sullivan and Tommy Nguyen and 7 other students who'd been driven from Riverside by Marcus's campaigns, compiled their stories and evidence, created a pattern of abuse that went back years, She contacted the state education department, filed formal complaints that bypassed Principal Davidson entirely, triggered investigations that couldn't be squashed by local influence. The unexpected allies emerged from shadows like an army assembling in secret. Veterans from the VFW who'd been watching Marcus's father use his position to give lenient sentences to wealthy DUI defendants while throwing the book at poor kids for minor offenses. Business owners who'd been squeezed by the Holloway's monopolistic practices. Teachers who'd been silenced for years but found courage in Sarah's example. Danny recruited his network of working-class men who'd served their country and returned to find that America served the wealthy first and everyone else never, who were tired of watching punk rich kids destroy vulnerable people without consequence. There was a moment in late February when Sarah could have destroyed Marcus completely, but chose mercy instead, and it demonstrated the difference between her character and his more clearly than any speech could have. She'd gathered evidence of Marcus's drug dealing. Yes, the Golden Boy supplemented his allowance by selling pills to other students, pills stolen from his mother's prescriptions, and resold at premium prices. She had video, transaction records, witness statements that would send him to actual prison, where Daddy's influence might not reach. But instead of going to Sheriff Brennan, who was corrupt, or to Judge Holloway, who'd bury it, she went to Mrs. Holloway directly, showed her the evidence privately, gave her 48 hours to get her son into treatment before Sarah went public. Mrs. Holloway looked at this 17-year-old girl who'd been tortured by her son for months, who had every right to destroy him, who was instead offering a path to redemption, and something broke inside her, not enough to change everything, but enough to plant seeds. She didn't get Marcus into treatment because he refused, and she was too weak to force him, but she stopped enabling quite so thoroughly, started saying no occasionally, created tiny cracks in the fortress of privilege that protected him. And Sarah walked away, having demonstrated that her moral superiority wasn't theoretical. She'd had the power to inflict devastating harm, and chose not to because revenge wasn't the goal, justice was. The climactic confrontation arrived in March, during the spring thaw, when snow melted to reveal all the things winter had hidden, when the world felt raw and exposed and ready for transformation. Marcus had planned what he thought would be his final victory, a party at his house while his parents were gone, where he'd orchestrated a scenario to assault Sarah, to break her physically since he'd failed to break her spirit, to finally extract the submission and terror he'd been seeking. He'd invited her specifically, made it sound like an olive branch, peace offering, chance to be accepted into the social hierarchy, and he'd made sure Chad and Derek understood their roles in what came next. Sarah accepted the invitation with that calm that should have warned him, brought Jamie Sullivan and 3 other students as witnesses, even though they weren't invited, wore a jacket with the camera Danny had given her, recording everything. She walked into that expensive house with its marble floors and designer furniture and walls covered with family photos that lied about happiness. And she carried herself like someone walking into battle with complete confidence in the outcome. Marcus saw her arrive and felt a moment of unease that he pushed down with alcohol and ego, told himself this was it. Tonight, he'd finally prove his dominance. But Sarah hadn't come alone in ways Marcus couldn't see. Danny and 5 other veterans were parked outside, monitoring everything through the camera Sarah wore, ready to intervene if things went according to Marcus's plan. Catherine Morrison was in her office with copies of all evidence, prepared to file criminal charges and civil suits if necessary. Mr. Reeves and Mrs. Patterson and Dr. Morrison were coordinating with parents of other victims, building a community response that would overwhelm local corruption with sheer numbers. The web Sarah had woven over months of patient preparation was about to snap closed, and Marcus was too drunk on his own power to see the trap he'd walked into. The party was everything Marcus's parties always were. Too much alcohol, too loud music, too many people trying too hard to prove they mattered, wealthy teenagers playing at rebellion, with the safety net of privilege always ready to catch them. Marcus held court in the living room, surrounded by followers, waiting for Sarah to wander into a vulnerable position so the assault could begin. But Sarah stayed in open spaces, always with witnesses, and she steered conversation with careful questions that got Marcus bragging, got him admitting things he shouldn't, got him confirming drug sales and previous assaults, and his father's interference with investigations, all of it recorded in high definition with timestamps and GPS coordinates. When Marcus finally made his move, drunk and impatient, grabbing Sarah and trying to pull her toward an upstairs bedroom, while his crew moved to block intervention, Sarah dropped him in 3 seconds flat, with techniques her father had drilled until they were muscle memory, a wrist lock that put him face down on his marble floor, controlled and humiliated in front of 50 witnesses, who pulled out phones and started recording. The golden boy, the untouchable prince, neutralized by a girl a foot shorter and 80 pounds lighter, his arm bent at an angle that promised injury if he struggled, his face pressed against cold stone while everyone watched. But Sarah didn't injure him beyond that momentary control. She released him quickly, stepped back, and addressed the room in a clear voice that cut through the music and the shock. She told them all that tonight's attempted assault was recorded, that Marcus's drug dealing was documented, that she had evidence of years of abuse and criminal behavior, that she'd filed complaints with state authorities who weren't subject to Judge Holloway's influence, that everyone who'd participated in the harassment campaigns should expect consequences. The room went silent, 50 teenagers suddenly sobering up and realizing that their fun and games had just become a criminal investigation. Marcus pulled himself up, his face purple with rage and humiliation, and he screamed at her, called her every slur he could think of, promised his father would destroy her, threatened violence that made clear this wasn't over. But his threats rang hollow now, exposed as the desperate bluster of someone whose power had just evaporated. Sarah looked at him with something like pity and told him he could change, could get help, could break the cycle his father had started, but that regardless of his choices, he would face consequences for his actions. Then she walked out with her witnesses, leaving Marcus standing in his expensive house, with his perfect life crumbling around him like the lies it had always been built on. The exposure happened fast once it started, like an avalanche that built momentum as it descended. Sarah's evidence reached the state education department, which launched a formal investigation that Principal Davidson couldn't block. Catherine Morrison filed civil suits on behalf of 9 families, seeking damages that would bankrupt even the Holloways if successful. Danny's veteran network organized a peaceful protest outside the courthouse. Dozens of men and women in uniform, holding signs about justice and accountability, putting pressure on Judge Holloway that he couldn't dismiss as easily as he dismissed complaints from the powerless. Local media picked up the story, not the Riverside paper, which the Holloways advertised in heavily, but state outlets and eventually national news, drawn by the perfect narrative of wealthy bullies versus working-class hero. The viral video came from that party, but not the footage of Marcus's takedown that Sarah kept private because destroying him completely wasn't the goal. Instead, it was security footage from Riverside High that Mr. Reeves had been saving for months. Compilation of Marcus and his crew harassing students, destroying property, assault captured in black and white with timestamps and context. Someone, probably Mr. Reeves though he never confirmed, posted it online with the title "Privilege and Cruelty, the Marcus Holloway Story," and it exploded across social media, millions of views in 48 hours, outrage building like a wildfire that money and influence couldn't extinguish. The corrupt adults fell one by one as their protection crumbled under scrutiny and public pressure. Principal Davidson was placed on administrative leave pending investigation into his failure to protect students. His years of looking away from obvious abuse finally subject to consequences. Sheriff Brennan faced state review of his department's handling of complaints, evidence of selective enforcement that favored the wealthy over the poor, documented in case files and statistics. Mrs. Walsh resigned from the school board under pressure from parents who'd finally found courage to speak up, who formed a coalition demanding accountability and systemic change. Judge Holloway found his cases reviewed by state oversight, his sentencing patterns revealing bias so obvious it bordered on parody, his corruption rendered undeniable by simple data analysis. But the most dramatic fall was Marcus's father himself, Judge Richard Holloway, whose iron control over the county had seemed absolute until it wasn't. Catherine Morrison's investigation into his past cases revealed pattern after pattern of wealthy defendants getting probation, while poor defendants got maximum sentences for identical crimes, of sealed records that should never have been sealed, of interference in investigations that protected his friends and allies while crushing their victims. The State Judicial Commission opened formal proceedings, and Judge Holloway, who'd wielded power with casual cruelty for 2 decades, faced disbarment and possible criminal charges for obstruction of justice. There was a moment of physical danger when Derek Santos, desperate to prove loyalty to Marcus and terrified of his own exposure, tried to ambush Sarah in the school parking lot with a baseball bat and rage-fueled stupidity. But Sarah's training and awareness saved her. She heard him coming, dodged the swing that would have crushed her skull, and put him down with precise strikes that left him curled on the pavement, crying, while Danny and 2 other veterans arrived within minutes, having been monitoring Sarah's location since the threats escalated. Derek faced assault charges as an adult, looking at real prison time, his scholarship and future destroyed by his choice to hitch his wagon to Marcus's falling star. The poetic justice came in layers, each one more fitting than the last. Marcus faced expulsion and criminal charges, his college acceptance revoked, his future transformed from guaranteed success to uncertain struggle. But more than that, his own traps caught him. The fake social media profile created for Sarah was traced back to his IP address through forensic analysis, making him guilty of cyberbullying and defamation, and the video he'd recorded of himself throwing Sarah's father's dog tags was used as evidence of theft and hate crime enhancement because of the racial slurs he'd included in his commentary. Every tool he'd used to hurt others became a weapon used against him. Every clever cruelty turned into legal liability. Every moment of documented abuse transformed into years of potential consequences. The legal consequences rolled out through spring and into summer, each one delivered with the weight of actual justice, finally applied to people who thought they were beyond its reach. Marcus was convicted of multiple felonies, including assault, drug distribution, and cyberstalking, sentenced to 5 years in a juvenile facility until age 18, then transferred to adult prison to complete his sentence. Judge Holloway was disbarred and indicted on federal corruption charges, facing 20 years if convicted, his wealth consumed by legal fees and settlements. Principal Davidson lost his job and credentials, ended up managing a discount store in a different state. His authority evaporated. Derek Santos took a plea deal that gave him 3 years, would emerge with a criminal record that closed most doors permanently. But Sarah insisted on redemption arcs because her father had taught her that people could change, that punishment without possibility of growth was just cruelty wearing justice's face. Chad Peterson, who'd followed Marcus more from weakness than malice, turned witness and entered therapy, began the long process of understanding how he'd participated in systematic abuse. His testimony was crucial in convicting Marcus, and his genuine remorse, expressed in tearful apology to Sarah that she accepted with grace, demonstrated that redemption was possible for those who chose it. Brittany Walsh, broken by her mother's fall and her own exposure, entered treatment for the eating disorder and depression she'd hidden for years, began slowly rebuilding herself into someone who helped rather than hurt. Mrs. Holloway divorced her husband and entered treatment for her alcoholism, sold the house on Riverside Drive, and moved into a modest apartment, got a job as a paralegal, and started attending meetings and slowly, painfully, rebuilt a relationship with her son through prison visits, where she finally became the parent she should have been all along. She apologized to Sarah in a letter that was raw and honest about her failures, about how she'd enabled Marcus's cruelty by being too weak to confront her husband. And Sarah wrote back with compassion because she understood that some victims became abusers, while others just became enablers, and both needed accountability and grace. Sarah's life transformed in ways both material and spiritual. The civil settlements funded her college education fully, eliminated her family's medical debt, allowed her father to get the surgery that restored some functionality to his damaged spine. She was offered scholarships to multiple universities, ultimately chose the same school that had trained her father, studied criminal justice and psychology because she wanted to understand systems and fix them. She gave a speech at Riverside High's graduation, invited despite not graduating for another year, talked about courage and character and the difference between strength and cruelty that left most of the audience in tears, and some adults examining their consciences for the first time in years. But the most emotional moment came one evening in June when Danny organized a ceremony at the Veterans Hall, where Sarah's father presented her with a certificate of completion for the training program they'd developed together. Recognition that she'd mastered not just the physical skills, but the mindset, the discipline, the commitment to protecting others that defined real warriors. The room full of veterans, men and women who'd served and sacrificed, and understood the weight of real courage, stood and applauded this 17-year-old girl who'd faced down bullies and corruption with the kind of bravery that didn't wear uniforms or get medals but mattered just as much. Sarah stood there in her discount store dress, holding the certificate her father had made himself because they couldn't afford fancy printing, surrounded by people who measured worth by character rather than bank accounts, and she felt peace settle into her bones like something she'd been seeking without knowing it. Her father, still unsteady on legs that would never fully heal, hugged her tight and whispered that she'd made him proud, that she was the warrior he'd trained her to be, that her mother and he loved her more than words could express. And Sarah, who'd been so strong for so long, who'd endured months of cruelty without breaking, cried into her father's shoulder, while the veterans who understood sacrifice better than anyone gave them privacy in their shared moment of victory and relief. The moral lessons crystallized in those months after the reckoning became stories told around Riverside and beyond about what happened when ordinary people found courage and systems finally worked the way they were supposed to. Honor and integrity proved stronger than wealth and power when enough people chose to stand up, when victims became witnesses and bystanders became allies, when documentation and persistence overcame corruption and influence. The institutions, school board, police department, courts, were revealed as only as corrupt as the people operating them, capable of reform when public pressure demanded it and oversight actually functioned. The breaking of abuse cycles required both accountability and opportunity for growth, punishment that educated rather than just punished, consequences that taught lessons rather than just inflicted pain. Marcus would spend years in prison thinking about the person he'd been and the person he could become, wrestling with the damage his father had done to him and the damage he'd done to others, facing the hard truth that understanding why he became cruel didn't excuse the cruelty itself. Some people would never forgive him, and that was their right. But some people would give him a chance if he earned it through sustained effort to be better. And that possibility of redemption was what separated justice from revenge. The difference between strength and cruelty became a mantra in Riverside after Sarah's story spread. A reminder that real power came from protecting others, not dominating them. That confidence didn't require putting others down. That character was built through adversity rather than bestowed through privilege. Teachers started noticing harassment earlier and intervening more consistently. Students found courage to report abuse and support victims. The culture shifted incrementally towards something less toxic because one girl had demonstrated what courage looked like in practice. True power, Sarah learned, came from protecting others, even at cost to yourself. From maintaining moral codes when breaking them would be easier, from choosing discipline over impulse and justice over revenge. Her father had taught her that warriors were defined not by their capacity for violence, but by their commitment to using force only to defend those who couldn't defend themselves. And she'd proved that lesson true by facing down predators with courage and intelligence rather than rage. But for Marcus Holloway, the lessons came too late and too hard, delivered with the brutal finality of consequences he'd always believed would never reach him. Prison was everything privilege hadn't prepared him for. Dangerous, degrading, controlled by men who saw his wealth and education as just more reasons to target him. The corrections officers didn't care about Judge Holloway's influence. The other inmates didn't respect his last name, and the system that had protected him for 18 years suddenly became the system that controlled every aspect of his existence. He learned fear intimately in those years, learned vulnerability and powerlessness, and what it felt like to be prey instead of predator, and the education was brutal and comprehensive and left scars that would never fully heal. He served 4 years before being released on parole at age 22, emerging into a world that had moved on without him, that remembered him only as the bullying psychopath from viral videos that would never be erased from the internet. His father was in federal prison. His mother lived across the country trying to build a new life. Their assets seized or depleted by legal fees and settlements. Marcus had a high school equivalency and a criminal record, and nothing else. No skills, no support system, no opportunities beyond minimum wage jobs that barely covered survival. He drifted for 2 years through cities and states, working warehouse shifts and fast food kitchens, living in homeless shelters and cheap motels, discovering that life without privilege was desperately hard, and that the America he'd taken for granted didn't actually care whether he lived or died. He tried reaching out to old friends and found their numbers disconnected, sent letters to his mother that went unanswered because she was fighting her own battles, applied for jobs that disappeared when background checks revealed his convictions. The isolation was complete and crushing, and sometimes Marcus thought about Sarah Chen and wondered if she ever thought about him, if she knew what her courage had set in motion, if she understood that she'd been right, that he could have changed, should have changed, but had made different choices, and now lived with consequences that would follow him forever. In early 2007, desperate and broke, he started hitchhiking north for reasons he couldn't quite articulate, maybe seeking Alaska because it represented escape, new beginnings, places where past didn't matter, maybe just running from the reality that his life had become a cautionary tale about privilege and cruelty. He caught rides from truckers and drifters, slept in rest areas, and survived on gas station food, moved through the Pacific Northwest with the kind of aimless wandering that comes from having nothing and no one anchoring you to any particular place. He was 24 years old and looked older, weathered by years that had been harder than anything he'd imagined possible. His good looks eroded by stress and cheap living, his confidence replaced by wariness and defensive hostility. The Alaska Highway stretched endlessly through wilderness that was beautiful and indifferent, mountains and forests that didn't care about his story or his pain or his regrets. Marcus got dropped off by a trucker near a pullout somewhere in the Yukon Territory, night falling fast and cold, and he set up the cheap tent he'd bought at a thrift store because sleeping outside was free and motels were luxuries beyond his reach. He had beef jerky and granola bars, a sleeping bag rated for 30 degrees that he'd need in temperatures dropping toward 20, and no clear plan beyond making it to Anchorage, where he'd heard there were jobs on fishing boats that didn't ask too many questions. He didn't notice the bear tracks in the soft earth near the pullout, didn't understand that setting up camp near food storage meant attracting predators, didn't have the wilderness skills that might have kept him safe because he'd grown up in privilege that insulated him from nature's realities. The black bear appeared just after dark, drawn by the smell of food and the vulnerability of prey that didn't belong in this environment. Marcus heard movement and turned on his flashlight and saw the bear emerge from the trees, massive and confident and hungry. And in that moment, he understood with perfect clarity that he was going to die alone in the wilderness, with nobody to save him and no one who would mourn him. He tried backing away slowly, like he'd seen in movies, but the bear kept coming, not charging, but not retreating either, closing distance with patient inevitability. Marcus's foot caught on the tent rope, and he fell, his flashlight rolling away, leaving him on the ground, staring up at a predator that saw him as food rather than a person, as meat rather than Marcus Holloway, with his tragic history and an unprocessed trauma and desperate hopes for redemption that would never arrive. The bear's breath was hot and rank, its weight impossible as it pinned him, and Marcus screamed for help that would never come, because he'd spent his whole life never needing help. And now, there was no one within miles who could hear him. The attack was not quick or merciful, and Marcus died slowly in the darkness while the bear fed. His last thoughts, a confused jumble of regret and pain, and memories of the life he'd wasted, the people he'd hurt, the chances for change he'd ignored until it was too late. His body wasn't found for 3 days, discovered by truckers who reported it to Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who investigated and filed a report about another hitchhiker who'd made poor decisions and paid the ultimate price, whose identification revealed a criminal record and estranged family, and no one demanding justice or answers or even basic dignity in death. Sarah Chen heard about it 6 months later through Danny Rodriguez, who'd kept casual tabs on Marcus's post-release trajectory through veteran networks, and had gotten a call from an RCMP officer who'd recognized the name from news coverage years earlier. Sarah was in college by then, thriving academically and socially, dating someone kind, working toward the future her courage had made possible. She sat with the news for a long time, trying to process what she felt about Marcus's death, and finally decided it was just sad, not satisfying or triumphant or even particularly meaningful. Just a sad end to a sad story about someone who'd never learned the lessons that might have saved him. She never celebrated his death because celebrating anyone's death diminished her own humanity, made her the kind of person who valued revenge over redemption, cruelty over compassion. But she also didn't pretend his death was a tragedy in the classical sense, didn't romanticize the fact that he died alone and afraid after years of making others feel exactly that way. It was simply the natural endpoint of choices made repeatedly over years, consequences arriving with brutal finality. A reminder that karma kept perfect accounts even when justice through human institutions was slow or imperfect. Marcus had become exactly what his father made him, had perpetuated cycles of abuse until they consumed him, had never found the courage to break free from patterns of cruelty that defined his existence, and the wilderness had delivered judgment that no court could. The true meaning of strength, Sarah reflected, while sitting in her dorm room reading about Marcus's death in a brief news article that barely mentioned who he'd been or what he'd done, was in choosing every day to be better than your worst impulses, to protect rather than harm, to build rather than destroy. Marcus had possessed every advantage: wealth, connections, intelligence, opportunities, and had used them to inflict pain because he'd never learned that real power came from uplifting others rather than crushing them. He'd had chances to change, offers of help, and paths toward redemption, and he'd rejected them all because his ego couldn't survive acknowledging fault or accepting accountability. Sarah graduated with honors, went on to law school, eventually became a prosecutor specializing in hate crimes and systematic abuse, building a career around protecting the vulnerable and holding the powerful accountable. She married someone who shared her values, had kids she taught about honor and courage and the importance of standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. She never forgot where she came from or the lessons learned during those months when Marcus Holloway tried to break her and failed. Lessons about resilience and character and the kind of strength that didn't need to announce itself through cruelty. Years later, speaking at a conference about bullying prevention and institutional accountability, Sarah told her story without using Marcus's name, focusing instead on the systems that enabled him and the community response that finally held him accountable. She talked about the importance of documentation, the power of allies, the necessity of courage, even when the odds seemed impossible. She ended with a statement about honor and dignity that had become her personal philosophy. That how you treat others when you have power over them defines who you truly are. That character is built through adversity and revealed through choices. That the measure of a person is in whether they use their strength to protect or to harm. What would you have done in Sarah's position, facing months of systematic abuse, with no protection from the adults who should have kept her safe? Would you have maintained her discipline and dignity, or would rage have consumed you? Comment below and share this story if you believe that courage and character ultimately triumph over cruelty and privilege, that accountability is essential for justice, that redemption is possible, but only through genuine effort to change. The world needs more people willing to stand up to bullies and corrupt systems, more communities willing to protect the vulnerable rather than the powerful, more examples of ordinary people finding extraordinary courage when everything pushes them towards silence and acceptance. Subscribe now to hear more stories about justice prevailing over corruption, about underdogs finding their strength, about the kind of heroes who don't wear capes, but who change the world through moral courage and persistent refusal to accept injustice as inevitable or unchangeable. The gunshot echoed across the frozen meadow, and Marcus Thornton watched his perfectly constructed empire crumble in real time as the FBI agents emerged from the tree line, their badges catching the harsh Wyoming sun. His face, once flushed with the arrogance of a man who believed his family's wealth could purchase immunity from consequence, now drained to the color of old snow as Special Agent Rivera read him his rights. The same meadow where he'd stood 3 months earlier, laughing with his father's attorneys about how they'd run that nobody ranger out of the backcountry, now bore witness to his destruction. His hands trembled as the cuffs clicked shut, and for the first time in his privileged life, Marcus Thornton felt the cold bite of real fear. But what these arrogant bullies didn't know, what they could never have predicted in their bubble of inherited power and purchased protection, was that the wilderness keeps its own records, that justice sometimes speaks through the silence of the mountains, and that one honest man's dedication to duty would bring down an entire network of corruption that had poisoned these lands for decades. Subscribe now to witness how a working-class hero's final act of courage exposed the truth and changed everything. But let's rewind to where it all began. On a crisp October morning in 1973, when Daniel Reeves reported for his first solo patrol in the most remote section of Yellowstone's backcountry, carrying nothing but a worn pack, a government-issue radio that crackled with static, and an unshakable sense of duty inherited from a father who'd survived 2 tours in Korea. Daniel had grown up in the shadow of these mountains, the son of a Shoshone mother and a white father who'd returned from war with shrapnel in his leg and nightmares that made him cry out in his sleep. Their cabin sat at the edge of the reservation, neither fully belonging to the tribal lands nor welcomed by the wealthy ranchers who'd built their empires on stolen territory. His mother cleaned rooms at the lodge in Jackson Hole, rising before dawn to scrub toilets used by tourists who spent more on a single dinner than she earned in a week. His father worked maintenance at the same lodge, his war injury preventing him from the hard ranch work that might have earned respect from the local cattle barons. Daniel learned early that dignity wasn't given, it was chosen, maintained through quiet acts of integrity, even when no one was watching. At 12, he'd found a wallet containing $800 outside the lodge, more money than his family saw in months, and he'd turned it in without hesitation. The tourist who'd lost it never even said thank you, but his father had gripped his shoulder that night with a strength that transcended words, and Daniel understood that some rewards transcended money. He'd put himself through community college, working 3 jobs, sleeping 4 hours a night, studying wildlife biology by flashlight in his truck between shifts. His professors noticed his sharp mind and tireless work ethic, writing recommendation letters that opened doors typically closed to kids from his background. When the National Park Service offered him a position as a backcountry ranger, his mother had cried, pressing her weathered hands to his face and speaking in Shoshone about how the mountains had always been waiting for him. His father had simply nodded, that same grip on his shoulder, and said, "You'll do right by the land. That's all that matters." Now, at 29, Daniel carried that responsibility like sacred trust, patrolling the most isolated sections of the wilderness where grizzlies outnumbered humans 10 to 1, and the nearest help might be 3 days' hike away. He knew these mountains the way some men knew city streets, reading the landscape in tracks and scat, and the way the wind moved through the pines. His supervisor, old Tom Hendricks, a Vietnam vet with a face like weathered granite and eyes that missed nothing, had taken Daniel under his wing from day one, recognizing in the younger man the same stubborn dedication to duty that had kept Tom alive in the jungle and honest in a world that rewarded corruption. The ranger station that served as Daniel's base of operations was a weathered log structure that smelled of pine smoke and coffee, maps covering every wall, notes and observations cataloged with meticulous care. He kept a journal recording animal movements, weather patterns, and increasingly, evidence of illegal activity in the backcountry. Poaching had always been a problem. Wealthy hunters who believed their money entitled them to trophy kills regardless of season or regulation. But lately, Daniel had noticed something more systematic. Survey stakes appearing in protected meadows, fresh ATV tracks where no vehicles were permitted, trees marked in ways that suggested logging plans. Someone was treating the wilderness like their personal property, and Daniel's careful documentation was building towards something, though he didn't yet understand the full scope of what he'd stumbled into. His routine began before dawn, checking his gear with military precision learned from his father's influence. Radio batteries fresh, backup set in his pack, water treatment tablets, emergency shelter, first aid kit expanded to include trauma supplies because grizzly encounters were no joke out here. Flares, bear spray worn at his hip like a gunslinger's revolver, though he'd only ever had to use it once in 3 years. His rifle, a lever-action Winchester that had belonged to his grandfather, carried not for sport, but for the reality that sometimes the wilderness demanded respect, backed by force. He moved through the mountains like he belonged there, which he did in ways that transcended the government paycheck. reading the land through generations of inherited knowledge his mother had passed down through stories and his own hard-earned experience. He knew where the grizzlies denned up, which meadows the elk favored, where the wolf pack had established territory, and most importantly, where humans had no business being. The first time Daniel encountered Marcus Thornton, it was in a protected meadow 5 miles from the nearest trail where someone had driven a pickup truck through a stream crossing that was explicitly closed to vehicles. Daniel had hiked in following the tracks, his jaw tightening at the deep ruts that would take years to heal, and found a group of men unloading surveying equipment. Marcus stood at the center, 26 years old, and radiating the casual arrogance of inherited wealth, wearing boots that cost more than Daniel's monthly salary and barking orders at the crew like they were servants. When Daniel approached, identifying himself as a ranger and explaining that they were in violation of multiple regulations, Marcus had actually laughed, a sound like breaking glass that carried no humor. "You know who my father is?" Marcus had asked, as if that question settled all matters. "Theodore Thornton, Thornton Land Development. We own half the private property bordering this park, and we're exploring our options for expansion." Daniel had kept his voice level, professional, explaining that this was federal land, that no expansion was possible, and that they needed to leave immediately and restore the stream crossing. Marcus had stepped close, invading Daniel's space with the confidence of a man who'd never faced real consequences, and said something Daniel would never forget. "Listen, Tonto, my father's lawyers have judges on speed dial. You're nobody. You write your little ticket, and I'll use it to wipe my ass. Now get out of our way before you lose that government job you probably needed affirmative action to get." Daniel had written the citation anyway, his hand steady despite the rage burning in his chest, and radioed it in to Tom Hendricks. He documented everything with photographs, measurements, and detailed notes. The surveying crew had packed up, but slowly, with smirks and muttered comments that Daniel ignored, because responding would only give them ammunition. Marcus had driven away in his truck, throwing mud deliberately as he crossed the stream, causing further damage Daniel added to his report. That night, back at the station, Tom had looked over the documentation and sighed heavily. "You did the right thing," he'd said, "but you need to understand what you're up against. The Thorntons have been trying to get their hands on parkland for development since before you were born. They've got connections at the state level, maybe federal too. This citation will disappear, and if you push too hard, they'll come after your job." Daniel had met his mentor's eyes and said simply, "Then I'll make sure the documentation is too thorough to disappear." Tom had smiled grimly, recognizing the steel in his protege, and replied, "Your father raised you right, just watch your back out there." The citation did disappear, just as Tom predicted, vanishing from the system within a week without explanation. Daniel received a call from a regional supervisor he'd never met, a man with a politician's smooth voice, suggesting that perhaps Daniel had been mistaken about the location, that maybe the truck had been on private land adjacent to the park boundary, that it might be wise to be absolutely certain before filing reports, that could damage relationships with important community members. Daniel had listened in silence, feeling the institutional pressure that protected money and power, and when the supervisor finished, Daniel had simply said, "I have photographs with GPS coordinates. They were 5 miles inside the park boundary. My report was accurate." There had been a long pause, then a thinly veiled threat about the importance of being a team player, and the conversation had ended with Daniel understanding that he was now marked as a problem. The harassment began subtly at first, in ways that could be dismissed as coincidence or bad luck. Equipment requisitions he'd submitted, items he needed for winter patrols, suddenly got lost in bureaucracy. His schedule was adjusted to give him the most difficult and dangerous routes, assignments that would keep him in the backcountry for weeks at a time with minimal support. He discovered that someone had filed a complaint alleging unprofessional conduct, claiming Daniel had been rude to visitors. Accusations that Tom helped him fight, but which left a stain on his personnel file. His truck, parked at the trailhead before a week-long patrol, had been keyed deeply, the slashes in the paint forming words he refused to repeat to his mother. But Daniel continued his work with quiet determination, documenting everything, building his case with the patience of someone who understood that truth had its own timeline. Marcus Thornton wasn't finished. His second encounter with Daniel came in early November, when Daniel was checking a series of backcountry campsites and found evidence of illegal hunting. A bull elk had been killed out of season, its head removed for a trophy mount, the meat wasted except for the back strap. The tracks told the story clearly. Multiple men, expensive boots, dragged the carcass to a clearing where a helicopter had landed to extract them and their trophy. Daniel spent hours documenting the scene, collecting shell casings and photographing the waste, his stomach churning at the disrespect shown to the animal and the land. He was cataloging evidence when he heard the helicopter return, its rotors beating the air like violent thunder. It landed in the same clearing, and Marcus Thornton emerged wearing camouflage that probably cost more than Daniel's truck was worth, carrying a rifle that belonged in a museum of excess. He wasn't alone. His entourage included 2 other young men who radiated the same privileged arrogance: Connor Sheffield, whose family owned a chain of ski resorts, and Brock Hayward, a state senator's son who treated laws like suggestions for other people. They saw Daniel and his camera, and their expressions shifted from surprise to calculation. "Well, look who's playing detective," Marcus drawled, his voice carrying that particular edge of cruelty that wealthy bullies perfected in expensive prep schools. "You find something interesting, Tonto?" Daniel had stood his ground, radio in hand, and identified himself officially, explaining that they were in violation of multiple wildlife protection laws, that the helicopter landing itself was illegal in the wilderness area, that he was documenting evidence for federal prosecution. Connor had laughed, a braying sound that scattered birds from nearby trees. "Federal prosecution? Jesus, Marcus. This one's delusional. Your dad's golfing buddy is the federal prosecutor." Brock had been filming on a handheld camera, and Daniel realized they were documenting this as entertainment, as proof of their immunity. Marcus had walked right up to Daniel, close enough that Daniel could smell the expensive bourbon on his breath, and said with chilling certainty, "Here's what's going to happen, Ranger. You're going to erase those photos. You're going to forget you saw anything. And if you're smart, you're going to start looking for another job. Because my father is about to make some calls that will end your career before you can say wrongful termination lawsuit." Daniel had kept his voice steady, maintaining professional distance, and replied, "I'm a federal officer witnessing and documenting federal crimes. You're now on record threatening a law enforcement officer. I suggest you leave immediately and arrange to turn yourselves in." What happened next would haunt Daniel's dreams for the brief time he had left. Marcus had grabbed for the camera, trying to snatch it from Daniel's hands, and in the struggle, Daniel had been forced to defend himself, using the defensive tactics taught in Ranger training to break the grip without escalating to violence. But Marcus had stumbled backward, falling theatrically, and his friends had immediately begun shouting about assault, about Daniel attacking an unarmed man, their cameras rolling as they created a narrative that inverted reality. Daniel had tried to explain, to show that he'd simply defended his equipment and himself, but they were already on their satellite phone, calling lawyers and sheriffs, and spinning a story that would reach official channels before Daniel could even get back to radio range. The helicopter had lifted off, leaving Daniel standing in the clearing with his evidence, and the sinking realization that he'd just played into their hands. The fallout was swift and devastating. By the time Daniel hiked out 2 days later, he'd been placed on administrative leave, pending an investigation into allegations of assault and harassment of park visitors. The photographs he'd taken of the illegal kill had mysteriously become corrupted in the evidence system, though Daniel had kept personal copies hidden in a location only Tom Hendricks knew about. A lawyer representing the Thornton family had filed a formal complaint demanding Daniel's termination, citing a pattern of aggressive behavior toward clients of their wilderness guide service, a service Daniel had never even known existed because it operated illegally in protected areas. The hearing was scheduled for January, and Daniel was informed that he should consider resignation as an alternative to termination, that his record would remain clean if he simply walked away. Tom Hendricks had been furious, pacing the ranger station like a caged wolf, cursing the corruption that had infected the service he dedicated his life to. "They're trying to run you out because you're effective," Tom had said, his hands shaking with rage, "because you care about the job more than politics. But we're going to fight this. I've got 30 years in the service, and I've got friends who remember when Rangers were judged by their work, not their willingness to look the other way." Winter deepened, and Daniel's suspension continued through December. He worked odd jobs to cover rent on his small cabin, splitting firewood for wealthy vacation homeowners who didn't recognize him. washing dishes at the lodge where his mother still cleaned rooms. She watched him with worried eyes, seeing the weight of injustice grinding down her son's spirit, and she told him stories about their ancestors who'd survived worse, who'd maintained dignity through generations of displacement and discrimination. His father, now in his 60s and moving slowly with his war wounds, said little, but his presence was steady as stone. They'd sit on the cabin's porch in the brutal cold, watching the mountains turn purple in the fading light, and his father would smoke his pipe and occasionally offer observations about patience, about how the wilderness had its own justice, about how truth was like water, finding its way through the smallest cracks. Daniel listened and drew strength from his parents' resilience, but the fire of righteous anger burned in him too, a determination not to let corruption win simply because it wore expensive suits and had judges on speed dial. What Marcus Thornton and his family didn't know was that Daniel had been building something beyond just evidence of their crimes. He'd been in contact with an investigative journalist named Sarah Chen, a woman who'd made her reputation exposing environmental crimes in Appalachia, and had recently moved west looking for news stories. She'd reached out after hearing rumors about conflicts between rangers and developers, and Daniel had been cautiously sharing his documentation with her, providing context about the systematic pressure to look the other way when wealthy families violated protected land. Sarah had connections with the FBI's Environmental Crimes Division, agents who were frustrated by local prosecutors' unwillingness to pursue cases against politically connected defendants. She'd also been talking to other rangers, other Park Service employees who'd witnessed or experienced similar corruption, and a pattern was emerging that went far beyond Marcus Thornton's illegal hunting trips. The Thornton Land Development Company had been involved in systematic fraud related to federal land acquisitions, using shell companies to make it appear that private inholdings within park boundaries were larger than they actually were, claiming grandfather rights that didn't exist, and most damning, bribing state and federal officials to reclassify protected wilderness as suitable for development. Through January, while Daniel waited for his hearing, the investigation Sarah had catalyzed was building momentum in the shadows. Federal agents were reviewing satellite imagery, comparing it to property records, and discovering massive discrepancies. They were interviewing retired rangers who'd left the service in disgust years earlier, documenting a pattern of institutional corruption that had allowed the Thorntons and families like them to treat public lands as their private playground. Tom Hendricks had provided testimony under seal, explaining how reports had been disappeared, how rangers who pushed too hard had been reassigned or forced out, how he'd personally witnessed Theodore Thornton meeting with regional supervisors in violation of ethics regulations. The case was growing beyond what anyone had anticipated, encompassing not just wildlife crimes, but fraud, conspiracy, and corruption at multiple levels of government. But Daniel didn't know the full scope yet, isolated in his suspension, waiting for a hearing he suspected was rigged from the start. The night before his scheduled hearing, Daniel received a call from Tom. His mentor's voice was tight with urgency. "Don't go to that hearing tomorrow. I mean it, Daniel. Take a sick day. Anything. Something's not right." Tom explained that he'd overheard conversations at the regional office, that there were people involved who shouldn't be, that the whole proceeding felt like a setup designed to force Daniel into a corner where he'd either resign or say something that could be used to justify termination without benefits or appeal. "They're scared of you," Tom said. "That means you're winning, but you need to stay in the game long enough for the real investigation to finish." Daniel had listened, understanding the wisdom, but feeling the pull of his own stubbornness. He wanted to face his accusers, to speak truth to their power, to defend his honor in the official arena, but Tom's next words changed his calculus. "The FBI wants you to go back out on patrol. They need you in the field, watching, documenting. They're going to make an official request that your suspension be lifted temporarily for a critical assignment. Play along, trust me." And Daniel did trust him, with a certainty that transcended doubt. The following morning, instead of attending his hearing, Daniel received official notification that he was being temporarily reinstated for a 3-week patrol assignment in the most remote section of the backcountry, a region called the Thoroughfare that was among the most isolated places in the lower 48 states. The ostensible purpose was to conduct a winter wildlife survey, checking on grizzly dens and documenting wolf pack movements before spring. but Tom had briefed him privately on the real mission. The FBI had reason to believe the Thorntons were planning something major in that area, possibly using the winter months, when Ranger presence was minimal, to conduct illegal surveys, or even begin preliminary work on an unauthorized development project. Daniel's job was to be their eyes, to document anything he found, to maintain regular radio contact with Tom, who would relay information to the federal agents. It was dangerous going that deep into the wilderness in January, with temperatures regularly dropping below zero and grizzlies still in their dens, but potentially aggressive if disturbed. But Daniel had accepted without hesitation. This was what he'd been trained for, what his whole life had prepared him for, and he felt the rightness of it in his bones. He'd spent 3 days preparing meticulously, checking and double-checking his gear, studying maps of the region until he could navigate it blindfolded, reviewing grizzly behavior patterns in winter months, and most importantly, maintaining his radio equipment. The radio was his lifeline, scheduled check-ins every evening at 8 p.m. when he'd report his position and any observations. Tom had given him a backup radio, civilian grade, but reliable, with instructions to hide it separately from his primary unit in case anything went wrong. Daniel's father had helped him pack, moving slowly but deliberately, adding items from his own military experience. Extra fire starters, backup ammunition, a thermal blanket that had saved his life in Korea. His mother had prepared dried meat and high-calorie trail food, pressing her hands to his face one more time and speaking softly in Shoshone, a prayer for his protection and for the land to recognize him as kin. Daniel had carried all of this with him as he set out on foot, skiing into the backcountry on a crystalline morning when the world seemed impossibly pure, the snow pristine, and the sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. The first week of patrol passed in solitude, broken only by his evening radio calls. He moved through the landscape like a ghost, documenting everything. Fresh tracks that revealed a pack of wolves hunting elk, the entrance to a grizzly den marked with GPS coordinates and respectful distance, frozen waterfalls that created ice sculptures of impossible beauty. He found no sign of human activity, no tracks or trails or equipment, and began to wonder if the FBI's intelligence had been wrong. But on the 8th day, he discovered something that made his pulse quicken. Fresh snowmobile tracks crossing a ridge where no recreational use was permitted, the machines having come from the direction of private land that bordered the wilderness. He followed the tracks for 3 miles, documenting with photographs and notes, until he found what they'd been carrying to, a cache of equipment hidden under camouflage tarps, including surveying instruments, plastic containers of fluorescent marking paint, and most damning, a map showing the area divided into parcels as if it were already approved for development. Daniel had photographed everything, noting the serial numbers on the equipment, and that night, his radio report to Tom had been detailed and urgent. What Daniel couldn't have known was that his radio transmissions were being monitored. Marcus Thornton, paranoid about the Ranger he'd failed to destroy through official channels, had purchased military-grade radio scanning equipment and had been tracking Daniel's movements throughout the patrol. He'd heard the evening check-ins, plotted Daniel's position, and realized that the Ranger had found the cache that represented months of illegal preparation for a massive land grab his father had orchestrated. Marcus had made a decision then, fueled by cocaine and rage, and the entitled certainty that he could solve any problem with money or violence, that the Ranger had to be eliminated before he could bring the evidence out of the wilderness. He'd gathered Connor and Brock, both of them drunk on similar certainty that their family's wealth insulated them from consequences, and they'd begun planning something unthinkable. But they were amateurs at real violence, spoiled men playing at danger, and they needed help from someone who actually knew the wilderness and its predators. They'd hired a guide named Ray Kilmer, a man who'd been banned from working in the park after multiple violations, but who knew the backcountry intimately and who would do anything for money. Ray was a different kind of criminal than Marcus and his friends, harder and meaner, a man who'd actually killed before, though never been convicted, and he listened to their plan with growing concern, not about morality, but about practicality. "You want me to make a Ranger disappear in the wilderness?" he'd asked, and Marcus had nodded, offering an amount of money that made Ray's eyes narrow with calculation. "It needs to look natural," Marcus had insisted. "An accident. Something that happens to Rangers out there. Bears, maybe. Winter kills people all the time." Ray had considered it, knowing that a grizzly attack, while rare in winter, wasn't impossible if a bear was disturbed from hibernation, or if one of the bachelor males, who sometimes stayed active, was provoked. He'd agreed, and they'd begun planning Daniel's murder with the casual disregard of men who'd never faced real consequences. On the 10th day of his patrol, Daniel had been returning to check the equipment cache, wanting to document if anyone had visited it when he'd noticed something wrong. The snow around the area had been disturbed beyond what wind could explain, and there were boot prints, human tracks trying to move carefully, but still visible to his trained eye. Someone knew he'd found the cache, and they'd been there recently. Daniel's instincts, honed by his father's lessons and his own experience, screamed danger. He'd moved away from the cache, changing his planned route, and that night, his radio call to Tom had included a coded phrase they'd arranged. The weather's changing faster than predicted. It meant he felt threatened that something was off, and Tom's response had been immediate. Consider pulling out early, we have what we need. But Daniel had hesitated, thinking about all the times he'd been pushed, all the times corruption had won because good people retreated, and he'd made a decision that would haunt Tom Hendricks for the rest of his life. One more day, Daniel had said, I want to document if they return to the cache. It was a reasonable operational decision, tactically sound, but it would prove fatal. What Daniel didn't know was that Ray Kilmer had been scouting a grizzly den for 2 days, watching from a distance with binoculars, waiting for the right moment. The bear was a massive male, over 800 pounds, who denned late and was sleeping restlessly. The winter not yet cold enough to fully shut down his metabolism. Ray had developed a plan that was elegant in its brutality. He would use Daniel's own radio signals to track him, determine his route, and then deliberately disturb the grizzly, driving it toward where the ranger would be, creating a lethal encounter that would look exactly like the kind of tragic surprise meeting that killed backcountry users occasionally. Marcus and his friends would wait at a safe distance, ready to document with cameras that they'd been nowhere near the scene, that they'd been on their own legal hiking trip miles away when they heard about the tragedy. It was a plan that might have worked if they'd been dealing with an ordinary ranger, but Daniel Reeves was far from ordinary. On the morning of the 11th day, Daniel had broken camp at dawn, moving toward the equipment cache through terrain he'd memorized. The temperature had dropped overnight to 20 below zero, and the world was silent except for the crunch of his skis on the snow and the rasp of his own breathing. He'd been alert, watching for any sign of human presence, his rifle slung across his back and his bear spray readily accessible despite the cold. He'd reached the cache and found it had been moved, the equipment hastily buried under fresh snow in an obvious panic, and he'd been photographing the new location when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong, the roar of a grizzly bear not groggy with hibernation, but fully awake and enraged. Daniel had spun, bringing his bear spray up, and seen the massive silhouette charging through the trees, covering ground with terrifying speed. He deployed the spray, creating an orange cloud that should have stopped any bear, but the wind, which had been calm moments before, suddenly gusted from behind him, carrying the spray away uselessly. The bear kept coming, and Daniel had realized in that instant that this wasn't a natural encounter, that something had driven this animal into attack mode artificially. He dropped the spray and swung his rifle around, leveraging it with practiced speed. But the bear was impossibly fast, closing the distance before he could aim. The collision had been like being hit by a truck, 800 pounds of muscle and fury driving him backward into a snowbank. Daniel fought with every ounce of training and survival instinct, using his rifle as a club, striking the bear's sensitive nose, aiming for eyes, fighting with the ferocity of someone who understood that this was murder, disguised as nature. The bear had reared back, confused by prey that fought so effectively, and in that heartbeat of space, Daniel had rolled, grabbing for his rifle, which had fallen in the snow, his hands closing on it just as the bear charged again. This time, he got the shot off, the Winchester's report echoing across the frozen landscape. The heavy bullet taking the bear in the shoulder, staggering it, but not stopping it. Another shot, this one into the chest, and the bear had finally fallen, its massive body convulsing in death throes that would have crushed Daniel if he hadn't rolled clear. He'd lain in the snow, breathing hard, his chest screaming with pain from where the bear's claws had raked through his heavy coat and the flesh beneath, blood already freezing in the extreme cold. His left arm hung useless, either broken or dislocated from the initial impact, and he could feel the hot wetness of serious wounds that needed immediate attention. But his mind was working clearly, analyzing what had happened with the cold precision his father had taught him. This bear should not have been awake, should not have been in this area, should not have charged through bear spray. Someone had driven it to him deliberately, and that meant they were probably still nearby, watching, waiting to confirm he was dead. Daniel had forced himself to move, dragging himself toward his pack, which had been torn open in the attack, scattering his supplies across the snow. His radio, his primary radio, was smashed beyond repair, crushed under his body during the attack. But the backup radio, the civilian unit Tom had insisted he carry separately, was intact and its protected case clipped to his belt under his coat. With hands shaking from cold and blood loss, Daniel had activated the backup radio, knowing that his regular evening check-in was still 8 hours away, knowing that Tom would be waiting for his call, that when it didn't come, search protocols would begin, but that might take days in this weather and these distances. He'd tried to transmit, but the civilian radio didn't have the power or range to reach the ranger station from this deep in the wilderness. He needed higher ground, needed to get to a ridge where the signal might carry, but his body was failing. The wounds from the bear worse than he'd initially assessed. His heavy coat was shredded, the insulation that kept him alive in this temperature compromised, and he could feel the beginnings of hypothermia mixing with blood loss, a deadly combination that he knew from his training was nearly impossible to survive without immediate help. Daniel had made a decision then, operating on reserves of will that transcended physical capacity. He'd created a shelter against a rock face, using his emergency bivouac and what remained of his gear, and he'd forced himself to perform field medicine on his own wounds, packing them with the trauma supplies his father had insisted he carry, treating himself for shock and hypothermia even as both progressed. He documented everything on the backup radio, recording messages that laid out what had happened, what he'd found, his certainty that the bear attack had been orchestrated, descriptions of the equipment cache and its GPS coordinates, everything he knew about the Thornton family's illegal operations. If he died out here, and he understood that death was probable now, he wanted the truth to survive him. He'd spoken his parents' names, told them he loved them, asked Tom Hendricks to make sure they understood he'd done his duty to the end. And then, as darkness fell and the temperature plummeted further, he'd wrapped himself in the thermal blanket and settled in to wait, to survive if possible, but to maintain the radio and the evidence, if nothing else. 3 days passed in that shelter, 3 days that existed in a haze of pain and fading consciousness as Daniel's body slowly shut down despite his enormous will to survive. He tried to transmit periodically, hoping to catch a moment when atmospheric conditions might boost his signal, but nothing seemed to reach. His wounds, despite his field treatment, had become infected in the filth of the bear attack, and fever made his thoughts drift. He'd hallucinated conversations with his father, with Tom, with his mother singing Shoshone songs from his childhood. He drifted in and out of awareness, losing track of time, understanding on some level that he was dying, but fighting it anyway, because surrender wasn't in his nature. On what he didn't know was the third night, his scheduled check-in long missed, and Tom Hendricks already mobilizing a search and rescue operation. Daniel's backup radio had finally caught a break in the weather and terrain, his desperate transmission reaching not the ranger station, but a fire lookout tower 50 miles away, an unmanned structure whose automated relay equipment picked up his signal and forwarded it to the dispatch center. The message that came through was fragmented, Daniel's voice weak and fading, cutting in and out of static. Attacked by bear, not natural. Thornton murdered me. Evidence at cache. GPS coordinates follow. And then a string of numbers before the signal dissolved into white noise. The dispatcher, a woman named Janet, who'd worked for the Park Service for 20 years, had immediately recognized the severity and had patched the recording through to Tom Hendricks, who'd been waiting by his radio for 3 days with growing dread. Tom had listened to Daniel's voice, heard the pain and determination in it, and he'd grabbed his coat and gear even as he was on the phone with search and rescue, with the FBI, with anyone who could reach that remote location faster. But faster in the thoroughfare in January meant at least a day by snowmobile if the weather held, longer if it didn't. And everyone involved understood that 3 days without radio contact meant the chances of finding Daniel alive were minimal. The search and rescue team that finally reached Daniel's location found him exactly where his GPS coordinates had indicated, in his emergency shelter, wrapped in his father's thermal blanket, the backup radio still clutched in his frozen hands. He'd been dead for approximately 12 hours, his body temperature dropping below sustainable levels sometime during the previous night. His massive will finally overridden by biology and physics. The scene told a story that was immediately obvious to the experienced rangers who found him. The dead grizzly bear nearby, 2 bullets in it from Daniel's rifle, the massive claw wounds on Daniel's body, the meticulous documentation in his scattered gear, and most damning, the tracks in the now wind-scoured snow that showed at least 4 other humans had been in the area watching from a distance as Daniel fought for his life and then retreated without offering aid. One of the searchers, a ranger named Pete Gallegos, who'd served in Vietnam with Tom Hendricks, had knelt in the snow and wept openly. This tough man, who'd seen horror in the jungle, broken by what had been done to a young ranger who'd represented everything good about their service. Tom Hendricks had arrived with the second wave of searchers, transported by helicopter despite the dangerous conditions, and when he'd seen Daniel's body, he'd felt something inside him harden into diamond-like resolve. This wasn't tragedy, it was murder, and he'd promised Daniel's spirit there in the wilderness that justice would be done, that the people responsible would face consequences, that Daniel's death would not be dismissed as just another backcountry accident. He'd personally collected the evidence, working with the FBI agents who'd accompanied the search team, documenting everything with the same meticulous care Daniel had shown. The equipment cache was photographed and seized, the serial numbers traced to purchases made by Thornton Land Development shell companies. The dead bear was examined by wildlife biologists who confirmed it had been drugged with stimulants, tranquilizers that had been reversed prematurely to create aggressive behavior, evidence of human manipulation that transformed a natural predator into a murder weapon. And most importantly, the area was searched until they found what Tom knew had to be there: observation posts where multiple people had watched, camera equipment including telephoto lenses, and most damning of all, a dropped satellite phone that belonged to Connor Sheffield. The FBI's investigation, which had been building methodically for months, suddenly kicked into high gear. Federal agents descended on the Thornton properties with search warrants, seizing computers, files, and communication records. They arrested Ray Kilmer within 48 hours, finding him attempting to flee to Canada, and faced with evidence that included his boot prints at the observation posts and communications on the satellite phone discussing the Ranger problem. Ray had made the calculation that men like him always make when facing life in prison. He cooperated. His testimony was detailed and devastating, laying out exactly how Marcus Thornton had hired him to kill Daniel Reeves, how they'd tracked the Rangers' movements, how they deliberately disturbed the bear and driven it toward Daniel, how Marcus and his friends had watched through telephoto lenses from safety, documenting what they'd thought would be an untraceable murder. Ray's cooperation led to phone records, to financial transactions, and ultimately to recordings that Marcus had stupidly kept as insurance against his friends, recordings that captured them discussing the plan in explicit detail. The arrests had happened at dawn on a February morning, coordinated raids that swept up Marcus Thornton, Connor Sheffield, Brock Hayward, and 3 others who'd been involved in the conspiracy. Federal agents had simultaneously raided Theodore Thornton's corporate offices, where the investigation into land fraud had reached critical mass, and arrested him along with 2 state officials and a federal bureaucrat who'd been accepting bribes. The scope of the corruption had been staggering, spanning years and involving millions of dollars in fraudulent land deals. But it was the murder of Daniel Reeves that captured public attention and made the entire case unignorable. Sarah Chen, the investigative journalist who'd helped build the case, had published a comprehensive story that ran in major newspapers across the country, complete with photographs of Daniel in his ranger uniform, documentation of the systematic harassment he'd faced, and most powerfully, excerpts from his final radio transmission, where he'd calmly documented his murder even as he died. The public response had been immediate and furious, with calls to the governor's office and congressional representatives demanding justice. memorial vigils held in cities across Wyoming and beyond, and donations pouring in to support Daniel's parents, and to establish a scholarship in his name for Native American students studying conservation. The trial had been moved out of Wyoming due to pretrial publicity and the depth of the Thorntons' local influence, held in Denver under a federal judge known for his intolerance of corruption and his military background that made him particularly outraged by what had happened. The prosecution's case had been overwhelming, built on Ray Kilmer's testimony, supported by physical evidence, phone records, and the financial trail that connected all the defendants. The defense had tried various strategies, claiming that Ray was lying to reduce his sentence, that the bear attack was genuinely accidental and the defendants had panicked rather than helped, that Daniel had been unstable and provoked the encounter himself. But every defense crumbled under the weight of evidence and the damning testimony of their own hired killer. The jury had deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on multiple counts, including conspiracy to commit murder, murder of a federal officer, witness tampering, and for Theodore Thornton, the additional charges of fraud, bribery, and corruption. The sentencing hearing had filled the courtroom beyond capacity, with Daniel's parents sitting in the front row, his mother holding a photograph of her son in his ranger uniform, his father's weathered hand resting on her shoulder. Tom Hendricks had given victim impact testimony that left the courtroom in silence, describing Daniel's dedication, his integrity, his potential cut short by men who believed their wealth entitled them to take a life as casually as they'd take a trophy elk. Other rangers had testified, creating a portrait of systematic corruption and a young man who'd stood against it at the cost of everything. When the judge had pronounced sentence, his voice had carried the weight of absolute moral certainty. Marcus Thornton, life in federal prison, without possibility of parole for murder of a federal officer. Connor Sheffield and Brock Hayward, 30 years for conspiracy and accessory to murder. Ray Kilmer, despite his cooperation, 40 years. Theodore Thornton, 25 years for his role in the conspiracy and the underlying fraud that had motivated the murder. The corrupt officials who'd enabled them received sentences ranging from 10 to 15 years, their careers and reputations destroyed completely, but the justice system's response had gone beyond criminal sentencing. Civil suits filed by Daniel's family, represented by attorneys working pro bono after Sarah Chin's story, had resulted in judgments that financially destroyed the Thornton empire. The family's fortune, built over generations, was dismantled to pay restitution and damages. Their development company was dissolved, its assets sold to conservation organizations that immediately donated the land to the National Park Service in Daniel's name. The private inholdings they'd fraudulently claimed were seized and returned to public ownership. Marcus Thornton's beloved ranch, where he'd grown up in privilege and cruelty, became part of a wildlife corridor managed by a coalition of conservation groups and tribal organizations. In essence, the thing the Thorntons had tried to steal and destroy through corruption was restored and protected by the very act of justice that punished them. What would you have done if you discovered corruption this deep? If standing up meant risking everything? If doing the right thing might cost your life? Drop a comment below, because this is exactly the kind of moral choice we all hope we'd make correctly, but never know until we're tested. The institutional reforms that followed were equally significant. The Park Service, under new leadership brought in specifically to clean house, had implemented sweeping changes in how rangers reported misconduct, protecting whistleblowers and creating direct channels to federal oversight that bypassed potentially corrupt local supervisors. Tom Hendricks had been promoted to regional director, given the authority to rebuild the culture of the Ranger Service into something that honored Daniel's memory and values. He'd personally recruited a new generation of Rangers, looking for candidates with Daniel's integrity and dedication, creating a force that would protect the wilderness not just from poachers and vandals, but from the kind of systematic corruption that had thrived in the shadows. The investigation had also exposed similar patterns in other regions, leading to reforms across multiple federal land management agencies and prosecution of corrupt officials in 3 other states. Daniel's death, while a tragedy that could never be justified or balanced, had become the catalyst for cleaning up decades of corruption. The memorial service for Daniel had been held in Jackson Hole, attended by hundreds of rangers from across the country, environmental advocates, tribal leaders from multiple nations, and ordinary citizens who'd been moved by his story. His parents had accepted the National Park Service's highest honor for their son, a medal usually reserved for rangers who died in the line of duty, but with an additional commendation for extraordinary courage and integrity. The Secretary of the Interior had spoken, acknowledging the institutional failures that had allowed Daniel to be placed in such danger, promising reforms, and most importantly, promising that the wilderness he died protecting would remain protected. Daniel's mother had spoken briefly in Shoshone, translated by a tribal elder, thanking everyone for remembering her son and asking that his memory inspire others to maintain integrity even when it's difficult, to protect the land for generations who haven't yet been born, to understand that true strength comes not from power over others, but from service to something greater than oneself. His father had said nothing, but his presence, standing straight despite his old war wounds, was its own testimony to the values he'd passed down to his son. The wilderness that Daniel had died protecting was renamed in his honor, a vast section of the backcountry designated as the Daniel Reeves Memorial Wilderness Area, with new protections that prohibited development in perpetuity and required regular ranger patrols to ensure compliance. A ranger station was built at the edge of the wilderness, state-of-the-art and properly funded, staffed by rangers who'd been trained in Daniel's methods of meticulous documentation and unwavering integrity. A scholarship program funded by donations and by the settlement from the Thornton estate provided full rides for Native American students studying natural resource management, with preference given to those who demonstrated Daniel's combination of academic excellence and moral character. The first recipients of the scholarship had included 2 young people from Daniel's own tribal community, kids who'd known him slightly and been inspired by his example, who now had the opportunity to follow in his path without the financial struggles that had marked his journey. But perhaps the most unexpected form of redemption came from within the Thornton family itself. Marcus's younger sister, Elizabeth, who'd been away at college during the events and had been estranged from her family for years due to their toxic values, had reached out to Daniel's parents after the trial. She'd grown up witnessing her brother's cruelty, her father's corruption, and had tried to escape it through distance and education. The trial had forced her to confront the full scope of what her family had done, and she'd made the difficult decision to publicly denounce them, to testify against them in the civil proceedings, and most importantly, to dedicate her life to making some kind of amends. She'd changed her name, rejecting the Thornton identity, and she'd gone to work for an environmental justice organization, using her insider knowledge of how wealthy families exploited legal loopholes to help close those loopholes, spending her professional life undoing the kind of damage her family had caused. She'd met with Daniel's parents, not to seek forgiveness because that wasn't hers to claim, but to acknowledge what had been done, and to promise that at least one person from the family that killed their son would spend her life trying to prevent similar injustices. Daniel's mother had listened, and then, in a moment of grace that spoke to her own character, had embraced Elizabeth and told her that the sins of the family didn't have to define her, that redemption was possible through action and dedication, that Daniel would have wanted her to use her knowledge for good. It was a moment of profound humanity that complicated the narrative of pure justice, with the reality that healing is possible even from the deepest wounds. Years after the trial, Tom Hendricks would sit in his office, now decorated with photographs of rangers past and present, and he'd think about Daniel often. He'd tell new rangers about the young man who'd come to the service with nothing but integrity and dedication, who'd faced systematic corruption and never compromised, who'd literally given his life to protect the wilderness and expose the truth. He'd use Daniel's story not as a cautionary tale about the dangers of the job, but as an inspiration about what the job meant at its core, about being a guardian of something larger than yourself, about maintaining integrity even when systems fail, about the absolute necessity of documenting truth, because sometimes your documentation is all that survives. He'd retire eventually in his 70s, having transformed the culture of the Ranger Service in ways that would outlive him, and his last act before leaving would be to hike into the Reeves Memorial Wilderness, to the exact spot where Daniel had made his final stand, and to speak a few words of gratitude to the mountains and the memory of a young ranger who'd shown everyone what true courage looked like. Daniel's parents had lived to see their son's legacy established, their small cabin becoming a place of pilgrimage for young rangers who wanted to meet the people who'd raised such an exceptional person. They'd aged gracefully, supported by the community that had rallied around them, by the scholarship fund that bore their son's name, by the knowledge that while Daniel's life had been cut short, his impact would ripple through generations. His mother would tell stories about him as a boy, about his inherent sense of justice, about how he'd been born with an old soul that understood duty and honor instinctively. His father would show visitors his war medals, and then Daniel's ranger badge, kept in a place of honor, and he'd say simply that his son had been a better man than he'd ever been, that Daniel had found his war in the wilderness and fought it with honor, that no father could ask for more. They'd established a small museum in their cabin, displaying Daniel's gear, his journals, his photographs of the wilderness he'd loved and protected, creating a space where his presence could still be felt by those who came seeking inspiration or simply wanting to connect with a story of genuine heroism. The mountains themselves seemed to remember Daniel, or perhaps that's just how Tom Hendricks chose to interpret the strange sense of peace that settled over the Reeves Memorial Wilderness. The wildlife flourished under the new protections, grizzlies and wolves and elk thriving in numbers not seen in decades. Rangers working in the area would sometimes report a feeling of being watched, but in a protective way, and they'd joke that Daniel's spirit had joined the mountains he died for, that he was still on patrol in some sense. It was romantic nonsense, probably, the kind of thing people told themselves to make sense of senseless loss, but it was also true that the wilderness Daniel had protected remained wild and free, that the corruption he'd exposed never took root again, that every ranger who patrolled that backcountry carried forward his legacy of integrity and dedication. In that sense, Daniel Reeves had achieved a kind of immortality, his brief life casting a shadow that would protect the wilderness forever. The story of Daniel Reeves became a case study in criminal justice classes, in environmental law courses, in ethics seminars for federal employees, and in Native American studies programs examining the intersection of indigenous values and public service. His final radio transmission was transcribed and analyzed, held up as an example of extraordinary courage and presence of mind under impossible circumstances. A man who knew he was dying, but prioritized documentation and truth over his own fear or pain. Legal scholars pointed to the case as a rare example of the justice system working as designed, where wealth and power were ultimately overcome by evidence and public outrage, where corrupt officials faced real consequences rather than comfortable retirement. Environmental advocates used Daniel's story to push for stronger protections for public lands and federal employees who expose corruption. And young people, particularly from Native American communities, looked at Daniel's photograph and saw possibility, saw someone who'd come from nothing and changed everything, who'd proven that integrity and courage could still matter in a world that often seemed designed to reward the opposite. If you made it to the end of this story, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel, because we need to share stories like Daniel's, stories that remind us what real heroism looks like, what integrity costs, and why it matters anyway. The world is full of Marcus Thorntons, people who believe their wealth and power place them above the law, above common decency, above the consequences that govern everyone else's lives. And the world is also full of systems that enable them, bureaucracies that look the other way, officials willing to sell their honor for campaign contributions or comfortable retirement, institutions that grind down the honest in favor of the connected. But the world also contains people like Daniel Reeves, ordinary people from humble backgrounds who possess extraordinary character, who face down corruption not with speeches or slogans, but with quiet, daily choices to do the right thing, regardless of cost. These are the people who change the world, not through grand gestures, but through accumulated moments of integrity, through documentation and duty, and the stubborn refusal to compromise on what matters. Daniel's story teaches us that justice is possible but never guaranteed, that it requires people willing to stand up even when standing up is dangerous, that documentation and truth-telling are powerful weapons against corruption, and that sometimes the cost of doing right is everything you have. It teaches us that redemption is complex, that even families destroyed by evil can produce individuals who choose differently. that healing is possible even from the deepest wounds, and that legacy matters more than lifespan. It teaches us that the wilderness Daniel died protecting is worth protecting, that public lands belong to everyone and must be defended from those who would privatize and exploit them, that environmental protection is inseparable from justice for the people who depend on and steward those lands. Most importantly, it teaches us that ordinary people can be extraordinary, that heroism isn't about superpowers or grand moments, but about choosing integrity over convenience, courage over safety, duty over self-interest, day after day until the accumulated weight of those choices transforms not just your own life, but the systems around you. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, with a young person trying to figure out what kind of adult they want to become, with someone working in a corrupt system wondering if one person can make a difference, with anyone who's ever felt powerless in the face of wealth and privilege and institutional failure. Share it because Daniel Reeves died trying to protect something he believed was worth dying for. And the least we can do is ensure his story continues to inspire others to similar courage. Share it because somewhere right now there's another ranger facing down corruption, another whistleblower deciding whether to speak up, another ordinary person standing at the crossroads between convenient silence and dangerous truth. And they need to know that they're not alone, that others have walked this path before, that justice is possible even when it seems impossible. Share it because in a world that increasingly feels like it rewards the Marcus Thorntons while crushing the Daniel Reeves, we need reminders that the arc of the moral universe really does bend toward justice, slowly and at terrible cost. But it bends nonetheless, pushed by people willing to sacrifice everything to move it. Daniel Reeves was 29 years old when he died in the Wyoming wilderness, killed by a combination of animal rage and human evil, murdered for having the courage to do his job with integrity. He left behind parents who loved him, a mentor who honored him, and a wilderness that will bear his name and his protection forever. He also left behind a legacy that transcends his individual story, proof that one person's courage can expose and destroy corruption that seemed invincible, that justice delayed is not always justice denied, that the powerful can be held accountable if the evidence is strong enough, and the public outrage loud enough. His life was brief, but its impact will echo through generations of rangers who patrol the backcountry with his example before them, through students who receive scholarships bearing his name, through the wilderness itself, flourishing under the protections his death strengthened and expanded. The mountains remember Daniel Reeves, and so should we all, not as a victim or a martyr, but as a model of what it means to live with integrity, to serve something greater than yourself, to face down evil without becoming corrupted by it, to maintain humanity and compassion even while demanding justice and accountability. This is the story of Daniel Reeves, a ranger, a son, a hero, a man who proved that honor and courage are not outdated concepts but eternal values that can still change the world, one documented truth at a time, one act of integrity at a time, one life lived fully in service to something worth dying for. She pulled into the parking lot at 6:45, noting that Brandon's BMW X5, purchased with his signing bonus, he'd made sure everyone knew wasn't there yet. He rarely